Listen how continuity moves by inches.
Some books prefer nouns to people, until one word changes the room. Not forgotten, released. Some doors open when you count the names. Memory is not a museum, it's a pantry. No invoice tonight, only release. Let the story keep its dignity, and let your body keep its sleep.
Over the next 2 hours, keep your own time. Breathe.
I was a priest once, not a famous one, not an infamous one, just a name stitched into parish registries and duty logs, someone you would pass in a corridor and nod to, someone who learned to stand a little to the side when cardinals glided by with their red berettas like moving fire. My punishment never made a headline. I was not the subject of a panel or a public rebuke. My punishment wore a gentler face. An office reassignment, a meandering silence, a door I was told never to open that lived inside my chest a long time before I ever turned a key in any lock. They said silence was sacred. I learned it was enforced. There is a particular weight to keys that do not belong to you. I kept a ring of 12, heavy enough that when I set it down on the wooden desk, the grain answered with a dull syllable, like an old oath. The ring was older than me, older than my father, perhaps older than the city above it, the city that people imagine as scripture carved into marble. The truth is less flattering. Stone breathes, marble sweats, and corridors sag with the fatigue of centuries, as surely as a man's shoulders do when he rises from prayer after too many hours. I learned that, too, carrying a lamp and a clipboard downstairs that no guide ever describes, through air that tasted of old copper, damp wool, and the faint animal sweetness of melted wax. Tourists do not know the way to the third sub-basement. Most scholars do not either. They request access to reading rooms with tall windows and Latin names gilded on door frames, rooms where the light makes everything look like a painting of learning. I was a junior custodian of the places where light came grudgingly and where learning wore chains. The lamps along the descent were set in shallow brass cups, each one dented by fingers that had lifted and lowered them for 100, 200 years. If you pass them lightly with your palm, ready to steady yourself, you can feel the small hollows where oil and human skin polished the metal into the memory of touch. Sometimes I would do it on purpose, floating my hand over them to ask a question I could not put in words. How many hands? How many nights? How many names? The basilica above hums, at all hours hums is the right verb. The Latin is a cloak, the music of vibration through stone. A low river you sense more in your bones than in your ears. People imagine the deep rooms beneath as hot, but they are cold in the way that a cellar is cold even on a summer afternoon. Hard cold, clean cold, the kind that makes your breath a private thing and your thought a visible cloud if you are foolish enough to exhale too quickly. There are doors in that cold with names that have been erased and repainted through so many regimes of handwriting that the wood remembers each alphabet. There are doors without names at all, and those, oddly, are the ones you learn to trust. It's the named doors that look at you the way a mirror looks when you approach in a dark room, as if they know a truth about you that you haven't earned yet. I have been asked, afterwards, whether I believed from the beginning, whether I approached those corridors with a romantic hunger for forbidden things, an adolescent thrill polished with ecclesiastical vocabulary. I did not. I believed in routine, which is the most powerful faith of all, in an institution built to outlast men. I believed in schedules, in notations, in the discipline of a broom, a pen, a cloth on brass, and a pen on paper. I believed in making myself small enough to fit between the attention of the important. I believed in standing just out of the way of consequence. That is the posture of survival. That is how you end up holding keys. The key ring's iron circle clicked faintly when I walked. I hated that at first. It made me feel like a warden in a parable, a man who knew the tally of the living and the dead. After a year, I stopped noticing. After 2, I measured time by the weight of that ring. It taught my hands its grammar, which key you cradle by the neck to avoid the bite of the jagged cut, which one you turn a fraction counterclockwise before feeding it forward, which lock likes to be coaxed with breath first to warm it, which lock demands an indifferent, quick authority. If you listen closely, you can hear locks speak. They don't say yes and no. They say keep going and careful. I kept a small notebook in my pocket, the pages full of little marks that only I could parse at a glance. There were days when I wanted to make them into neat sentences, but neat sentences have a way of making neat promises and neat enemies. So I used arrows, slashes, circles, dots of ink where hesitation lived. In the notebook were notations like this: 3rd stair colder than usual, check roof vents, or lamp 6 has a wick that leans right, replace at Compline and then further in. Where the pencil was softer because it was the end of a long day, the marks grew stranger. Door with erased name sounded hollow Wednesday. Ask Lorenzo if anyone moved boxes. Or smell like pennies and rain in room H13 at night. Or sideways across the margin because the notebook was too small and I was too tired to go find a larger truth. Silence here isn't absence. It has weight. Is 1, 2, 3. There is a difference between what men tell you and what walls tell you. Men tell you rules. Walls tell you habits. Men say, this corridor is closed to you. Walls say, people have always come here when they were afraid to be seen. Men say, this ledger does not concern your duties. Walls say, someone has stood in this exact spot for a very long time, breathing too fast, counting to 3 before turning the handle. Men wear robes and rings and their words outrun their own minds sometimes. Walls wear oil stains and fingerprints and their words never hurry. Sometimes, late in the night, when the courtyards above fell into that peculiar Roman hush that is not truly quiet but rather a truce between footsteps and fountains, I would unlock the first door of the 3rd sub-basement and feel the familiar ripple of dread and relief. Dread, because the air answered back. Relief, because down there, time behaved itself. The world above is full of improvisation, unexpected pilgrims, unexpected questions, the bright spark of a child's laugh in front of a painting that is supposed to impose awe. Below, the corridors are narrow and the decisions are simple. There is a shelf, there is a book, there is a ledger, there is a lamp. The rest is care. On a particular night later, I would look back at calendars and discover that even the calendar did not want to remember its date. I performed the ritual that is not in any book. I stood at the landing of the 3rd stair and listened. You can tell the night's mood that way. Some nights, the stone hums like a distant organ. Some nights, it is the dry rustle of vellum in a drawer. On that night, it was the soft a rhythmic tapping that comes from old wax contracting as it cools. It sounded like distant rain on a tin roof. It sounded like someone trying not to cry. I set the key ring down, and the desk answered in that dull syllable. I lit a match, because sometimes the electric lamps down there buzz in a way that presses against the inner ear and muddles thought, and I needed the steady, small speech of a flame. The match gave off that tiny aftertaste of sulfur, and then surrendered its heat to the candle, and the candle, grateful, settled into its work. Everything looked nearer with the candle lit. Shadows stepped forward to be counted. In the first room, where inventories are kept for things that no one wants to admit, require inventory the chains, the clasps, the buckles, designed for spines of books thicker than a man's hand. I found the ledger that begins this confession. It did not begin there, of course. Nothing that matters begins at its beginning. But that is where I first felt its gaze. Books do not have eyes, but they have weight, and the ledgers that mattered most down there have a weight that changes not when you lift them, but when you decide to lift them, as if they can tell the different moral arithmetic between should and must. It was bound in leather blackened to the color of pre-dawn, and around it was a chain made of links, hammered flat by someone who knew the compromise between strength and quiet. The chain was stamped, each link, with a sigil I did not recognize, 3 interlocked circles around a cross that wasn't quite a cross. Those shapes are not portraits, they are verdicts. The lock was not merely a mechanical one. Wax had been melted over the clasp at the last sealing, and the wax had been stirred with flecks of gold leaf, so that even now, years on, under bad light, the seal seemed to pulse with a dull, private sunrise. I did not intend to open it. I intended what all routine intends: to verify, to notate, to move on. The ledger sat where it was supposed to sit, according to the map in my head and the map on the shelf, 2 different geographies that rarely agree completely but agree often enough to keep a man employed. I ran my finger down the spine, and when I reached the 3rd dent from the top, the leather felt warm. The room was cold. Sometimes objects remember hands better than people do. A voice in me call it obedience, call it cowardice, call it the liturgy of a life spent fitting your outline to other people's expectations, said, not your business. Another voice, quieter but older, said, if you are the one who cleans the floor, you are the one who knows where the dust hides. In our world, knowledge is supposed to move down the hierarchy only as far as it is needed to move an object from one room to another. But dust disobeys that system entirely. It knows every door, so do the ones who keep the keys. I pressed my thumb against the seam of the seal. I did not break it. Not then. The wax had long ago become a brittle rind, and a fragment of it half-moon-shaped, with a barley grain of gold caught like a star, came away and rested in the crease between my finger and palm. The impression on it showed a lion whose heart was a padlock. In the gouge where the wax had been torn years earlier, the faintest trace of a word remained: sigillum. The rest was missing, as if a name had been swallowed mid-syllable. I did a thing I am not proud of. I slipped that red fragment into the cuff of my sleeve. It was not courage. It was curiosity. Wearing gloves, I tell you this as plainly as I can. There are 2 kinds of secrets down there. The first are theatrical, eager to be found, polished to look like films about themselves. The second are shy, folded into margins, reluctant the way a scar is reluctant. The Exorcist's ledger belonged to the second kind, Every part of it said, "Don't look," but none of it said, "Leave." It offered the old, impersonal hospitality of a locked door that is not locked against you personally, only locked because that is its nature. It asked nothing. It waited to be read. Men talk about demons in rooms with windows, because windows are where fear can see its own reflection and flee. In rooms with no windows, demons become administrative. They have dates and times, names and witness signatures. You can file them. You can misfile them. That is a power the world understands. The ledger, when I finally unclasped it with a care that left the chain asleep and the wax untroubled, breathed a moth-thin dust into the candlelight, and that dust smelled like old blood on parchment, and a faint sweetness, as if someone had once crushed a dry fruit between its pages and then apologized too late. Columns, neat as choir stalls. Dates like stepping stones across a dark river. Names that wore Latin endings like masks. And then, at the far right, a column that did not fit. Notations in a smaller hand, a careful hand, the hand of someone who wanted to look obedient in case an obedient-looking hand would buy them leniency. The word appeared over and over with the prim politeness of bureaucracy. Oblitus. Forgotten. Each line paired a ritual with an erasure. Each entry ended not with the departure of a dark presence, but with the departure of a memory. I closed the ledger gently, as if it were sleeping, and stood very still. Above me, something moved, perhaps a chair, perhaps a passer-by in rubber-soled shoes, perhaps nothing at all but the building shifting its dreams from one shoulder to the other. I waited until the little draft that accompanies such movements drifted away down another corridor. Then I opened the ledger again and put my finger on a particular entry, not because I knew it would matter later, but because the name was the name of a street I loved as a seminarian, a street where the baker's wife used to put an extra heel of bread in the paper bag when she saw me coming. The ritual had been performed in a hospital room. The date was a winter Wednesday. The note said, "Successfully removed the name. Patient's mother no longer recalls the baptism." I told myself that it was metaphor. Priests lie to themselves in tender tones, like mothers soothing a child after a nightmare. At the back of the ledger, where such books often keep their pockets for small enclosures, bits of ribbon, authoritative scraps that prove a point or erase one, there was space for a seal. The seal was missing. The leather wore a round scar, a bald smoothness where wax had once softened and then hardened into its exact opposite, brittle and absolute. The absence had a temperature. I don't know how else to tell it. I felt it in the fingers of my left hand, where the ring of keys had made calluses that were no longer tender. I felt it in the small place between shoulder blades, where a man stores the breath he needs for difficult truths. I knew the seal had existed, and I knew, in the strange way you can know a thing without evidence, that the missing seal and the little half-moon inside my sleeve were kin. Some objects recognize each other like relatives at a funeral. I was not brave. If you are listening for the moment when I became brave, you will be disappointed. Courage is a word the living use to make sense of events the past has already sealed. I was simply a man in a room with a candle and a book, and the book did not want to be alone. That is the whole of it. I should have closed it. I should have made a neat note in my little notebook. Inventory completed, chain intact, wax disturbed previously, receipt on shelf. I should have locked the door. Instead, I did the smallest thing a human being can do to rearrange the universe. I said a name out loud. It was not the name of a demon. It was the name of a child I had baptized 5 years before in a town far from Rome, a child with a mother who wept and laughed in the same breath, and a father who held the white garment as if it were made of snow that might melt. I said that ordinary child's name in a room full of extraordinary caution, and the candle went briefly taller as if someone had just inhaled sharply. And then, to my embarrassment, I began to cry. I tell you this because I want you to understand the proportion of things. When people write about secrets, they make the secrets enormous and the people small. In fact, it is the ordinary that terrifies the secret most. An honest name, a loaf of bread, a father learning to tie a new knot, a mother folding a t-shirt warm from the line. The ledger was not a monster. It was a machine. It turned blessings into receipts. It turned testimonies into footnotes. It turned love into a misprint you could correct with a rubber stamp if you had the right clearance. It did not hate. Machines do not hate. They obey. The corridor behind me cooled further. It is possible the temperature did not change at all, and that only my blood believed it did. I learned later to mistrust the body's commentary on fear. It is a messy narrator, fond of exaggeration, hungry for metaphors that will justify retreat. I steadied my breathing on the old monastic count. Inhale to 7, hold to 4, exhale to 7, and found, in that rhythm, the floor again under my feet. I closed the ledger. I did not put it back. In the small gray hours, each decision looks larger than it is because there are no other decisions nearby to keep it company. I placed the ledger on the desk. I set the key ring beside it. I blew the candle almost out, then relit it, because sometimes a light must be freshly started to say the things it would not say when it had grown complacent. Somewhere in the deep of the building, a pipe coughed, and water went on a private errand, and the stone, which has a life best understood by geology and prayer, shifted its weight, and above me the basilica patient, heavy, full of names I had been taught to revere, breathed. I do not know whether it breathed me in or breathed me out. You want me to say that I knew already that I was in danger. I did not. I had for too long learned the comfortable arithmetic of insignificance. Important men are seen. Men who open and close doors are not. That is how a city continues in its chosen direction without having to announce every step. The next morning, after I slept a thin, unsatisfying sleep with the smell of wax and leather still on my skin, I made coffee with scalding water and burned my tongue. I dressed. I returned. The ledger waited. Nothing had exploded. No one had come running. The worst part of disobedience is the way the world declines to cheer or punish you for it. It simply watches to see whether you will continue. I continued, but I did so like a man trying a new path through a familiar garden, counting landmarks to convince himself he will not get lost. Lamp, dented by the thumb, crack in the fourth stair like a thin smile, door with erased name, door with no name, and a habit of sticking in damp weather. Desk that answers with a wooden syllable when the weight of keys stutters over its surface. In that garden, a thought had begun to bloom. The thought was this: perhaps the ledger is not a record of victories, but an instruction manual for removing evidence of a certain kind of victory from the record. Perhaps exorcism, in a certain light, looks like a supply chain for forgetting. All of this is to say, Chapter 1 begins not with a revelation, but with a man standing in a cold room and noticing his breath. It begins with a ring of 12 keys and the simple grammar they teach the hand. It begins with a candle whose small authority proves stronger than the electrical hum. It begins with leather that remembers its makers, a chain that remembers its hammerer, a seal that remembers the breath of the one who warmed the wax before pressing a ring into it. It begins with a word oblitus that looks harmless in a margin until you count how often it appears. It begins with the smallest theft I ever committed, a fingernail of red wax flecked with gold, sleeping in the cuff of my sleeve like a stowaway star. I want to tell you, now, what the ledger felt like when I carried it alone across the narrow distance between shelf and desk. It felt like a reluctant child, not heavy because of its weight, but because of its will. There are objects that resist motion, not by mass, but by meaning. The ledger was such an object. Put your hands under such a thing, and you can sense the pressure of every hand that has held it before, every rule it has enforced, every comfort it has sold to frightened people. I have held infants at the font, and old men at the end, and neither felt as deliberate as that book. I do not know how long I stood there reading and not reading. Time, the building's favorite commodity, grew slippery. Down there, it prefers to be counted not in minutes, but in small decisions. Turn a page, wet a fingertip, shift a foot, look up when a floorboard answers with a syllable, look down when an irregularity in the ink suggests a hesitating pen. In that measure, I passed through perhaps 2 hours. In the other measure, the one the world prefers, where we put hands on clocks and let clocks lay their hands on us, perhaps 30 minutes. I do not know. And that ignorance is a better description of the ambiance than any detail I could give you. On the ledger's second page, a line did not add up. The date, the place, the witnesses, the prescribed prayer, these aligned. The notation at the right margin, the column where the small, obedient hand had inscribed oblitus with the implacable tidiness of masonry, was absent. In its place, a dot of ink that had been pressed hard enough into the vellum to pucker it, as if the pen had been poised to make the fatal letter and someone's hand had struck it aside. The pucker had dried into a tiny mountain range. You could climb it with your finger if you were very patient and lacked a sense of your own dignity. I am no patient man. I am, however, sometimes a man without dignity. I climbed. My fingertip found the ridge. It found the small valley behind it. It found, on the far side, a faint indentation where a different word had been attempted and abandoned. The first letter might have been an S. I looked at the door. I looked at the key ring. It looked back, which is to say, it did not. Keys do not care who you become. They only notice where you go. I placed the fingertip of my left hand in the center of the book to hold the pages awake and used my right hand to draw the candle closer. Wax hopped in alarm at being moved and then settled into a new geometry. Shadows rearranged their negotiations. The S became clearer, not in ink, but in the slight press of a nib into a living surface some working midnight long ago. Someone had tried to write something else. Not oblitus. I did not know the word yet. I knew only that the habit had been interrupted by a hand or a breath or a thought. I closed my eyes and could feel the room that night. A man, like me, standing with a book and a decision, and the basilica above him breathing in its sleep. I had come to the church because I wanted, like all children who stay too long in libraries, a map that would not lie. It is not a noble motive, perhaps, but it is not wicked either. I wanted someone to tell me what to do with the dead. I wanted someone to tell me what to do with the living. I wanted a place where words were not a sport, but a sacrament. I wanted a calendar that meant its days. I wanted to look up from the page and see, carved into stone, confirmation that the page and the stone had shaken hands and agreed to be true together. I tell you this because some part of me still believed that when I opened the ledger, and perhaps that is why I cried when I said the child's name out loud, it was not the ledger that betrayed me. It was the map I had invented for myself. All of this, you might say, is an overlong way of telling you that I stole a fragment of wax and peered at a book. But if you have ever stood on a shore at night and listened to a sea you cannot see, you know how sound can persuade you that distance matters less than direction. This is the direction. I was a man whose job was to keep certain doors respected. I opened one of those doors inside myself and allowed a question to step through. The question did not roar. It did not demand. It looked at me with a patient, humiliating kindness and asked, "What would you do if the blessing you were asked to confer was merely an invoice written in a language the desperate could not read?" The spectres, I did not answer. I did not even know yet that I had heard the question. I did what I had been trained to do. I made a note in my notebook, Ledger 7, seal, missing, check chain, must ask about re-waxing. I returned the candle to its accustomed place. I nestled the ledger back into the shadow between its neighbors. I lifted the key ring. The desk spoke its dull syllable. I turned out the electric lamps that still murmured at the edge of hearing about the bargains they had made with shadow. I closed the door and made the lock say its little sentence to signal that the corridor had returned to the rules. I climbed the stairs, counting 4, 8, 12, because some days numbers are kinder than names. I went out into a courtyard where dawn had not yet made promises. Only later did I admit that something in me had already opened and would not close. Only later did I say to myself, in the belonging loneliness of a small apartment with a kettle that boiled sullenly and a window that showed a slice of a dome as if it were the world's shoulder, that perhaps silence is not sacred when it is purchased, that perhaps it is only expensive. Only later did I put the fragment of red wax on my windowsill like a foolish relic and watch the morning take its color seriously. Only later did I know the name of the missing word, solutus. Released. But tonight, this night, that begins the telling, this night you must understand, to stand beside me for what follows tonight, I was only awake. That was enough. Awake to the cold. Awake to the way a candle corrects a room that has forgotten itself. Awake to the knowledge that secrets do not bend reality so much as catalog the places where reality is already tired enough to agree with them. Awake to the keys that taught my fingers their grammar. Awake to the possibility that my punishment, when it came, would be so quiet I would miss it if I did not practice listening now. I was a priest once. I still know the shape of a blessing. I know how to lift a hand, how to draw a small cross in the air, how to press a palm to a brow that burns with fever or fear. There is a blessing that lives under all the others, a small one that no book teaches. Stay awake. It is the first we learn and the first we forget. It is the only one I can offer you from here, in this cold room under a breathing church, beside a ledger that wants to be both witness and accomplice. Stay awake. Listen to the doors. Learn the locks' grammar. Do not be afraid of the quiet questions. They do not intend to embarrass you. They intend to see whether your memory is for sale. The candle sighed. The ledger slept with its chain slack around its belly like a defeated argument. The wax fragment warmed in the cuff of my sleeve against the thinnest pulse of my wrist. I picked up the ring of 12 keys. They rang together like a small bell choir tuning itself for a service whose hour had not yet been announced. I stepped toward the corridor, and the corridor, with the good manners of old stone, stepped out of the way. And that is how the door inside me opened first, without spectacle, without a witness I could name, without even an amen, only the sound of iron agreeing with iron, and my breath, and the city above arranging its prayers into something that sounded like weather. I kept returning to the third stair because it felt like the first honest sentence the building ever said to me. It is a shallow rise, that stair worn at the center so that the stone's back shows through the original polish, as if countless careful shoes had eroded ceremony down to bone. Pilgrims do not climb those steps. The important do not notice them. They are steps for the hands that carry keys and the backs that remember boxes. By the time a man counts the third stair by instinct, he has learned how the building prefers to be approached, with the respect one gives to an elder whose rules are not all written and whose memory is more accurate than yours. The night after I first slid the half-moon of wax into my sleeve, the corridor greeted me with a cold that rang like metal. Not cruel, not punitive, precise. The kind of cold that makes sound travel truer, so that a whisper keeps its shape and a footfall confesses how much it weighs. I had slept the way a guilty page sleeps inside a book, half-pressed, half-forgotten, awakening at every shift of the covers. I boiled coffee until the kettle sounded like a suppressed shout, and burned my tongue again, as if I deserved a small pain I could name. When I reached the landing, the brass lamps blinked like creatures startled awake, then recognized me and resumed their ancient habit of ignoring the obvious. The key ring taught my fingers its grammar all over again, because keys are the best kind of teachers. Patient, repetitive, incapable of flattery. The lock on the third stair's door is a ceremonial liar. It resists the first turn so that a man will reconsider. It yields to the second so that he will believe in mercy. It sticks at the third to ensure he means it. On the fourth tug, if breath and resolve align, it speaks a small syllable I learned to hear as consent. That night, it consented, and the corridor released its faint exhalation paper. Cold stone, a sour alchemy of old glue and mouse fear, the iron smell of a room that remembers blood without ever needing to say the word. I lit the candle again, though the electric lamps could have done the job with their indifferent fluorescence. The candle's light corrects a room. It makes it smaller, and by making it smaller, makes the truths fit. The Exorcist's ledger waited where I had put it back, which is the kind of mercy you must not waste. Some secrets move when you look away, out of pride or fear. This one stayed. The chain lay slack around its belly, like a belt loosened after a heavy meal. The missing seal's bald circle stared at me, an absence so exact that the mind tries to fill it, the way eyes put constellations into disordered stars. Routine was my alibi and my drug. I took the book to the desk, set the keys down, let the wood pronounce its usual monosyllable, and drew the candle close until the wax leaned toward the heat like a tired man leaning toward a sympathetic shoulder. I unhooked the clasp with the gentleness one learns after years of coaxing stubborn mechanisms to choose compliance over spectacle. The first page rose of its own accord, then settled, the vellum breathing in the sudden warmth. Columns again, choir stalls for ink. The leftmost column hosted dates so neat you could have played chess on them. Beside it, places, some Latinized beyond recognition, some humble as kitchen tiles. Witnesses in a hand that wanted to reassure by tidiness. Then, the rightmost column, the column that had sat in my thoughts all day like a stone in a shoe. Oblitus, forgotten. Not always there were gaps, and the gaps unnerved me more than the entries. It is the patch of untouched snow that makes you wonder what's hiding under it, not the boot prints. On some lines, the word had been etched with the severity of a verdict. On others, it floated like an afterthought, as if the pen had remembered at the last second what the ritual required. I had told myself, that first night, that forgotten was probably metaphor or clinical shorthand for that sigh of relief that follows a crisis when the mind chooses not to revisit what it cannot use. Priests are good at baptizing ignorance with respectable names. We call it peace. We call it closure. We call it acceptance. A ledger does not care what we call it. It cares that the boxes align. On page 3, there was a line that fixed me like a pin fixes a specimen. The exorcism had taken place not in a bedroom or a cellar or a church, but in a library. The witnesses were listed as Sister M from the Sisters of Charity, a doctor whose name I will not repeat, and custodian on duty. No name, just a function. We vanish ourselves more efficiently when we agree that functions are identities. The notes were tidy as always, the prayer abbreviated with a scholar's decorator's instinct for Latin. And then, at the far right, the obedient hand had written oblitus, then paused, then written it again, over itself, as if a first draft of forgetting had not satisfied. I could see the pen digging deeper on that second pass. I could see the nib fray minutely at the edges, the way a voice frays when it repeats itself under pressure. I leaned so close that the candle threatened to smudge the margins with its breath. The vellum's pores drank light. In the faint ridge beneath the layered word, a ghost of a curve haunted the fiber, the beginning of a different letter. If I had been a better scholar, I would have gone to the catalog, found the witness logs, cross-referenced the day, interviewed No, interrogated the mop, the window latch, the dust. I was not a scholar. I was a man with a candle and a borrowed courage. So I did what men in rooms do when the world outside is too large for their questions. I kept reading. The ledger's entries in that section began to change their temperature. Earlier, the cases read like storms, fast, loud, and gone by morning, leaving trees bent and neighbors on the stoop comparing descriptions of what none of them understood. Later, they cooled to administrative weather. The prayers were shorter. The places were less distinct, as if anonymity itself were part of the ritual. The witnesses thinned. The column of forgetting grew sleek in its confidence. Then came a run of pages, marked with a tiny symbol in the upper right corner, almost too small to notice, as if a bug had died there and been politely erased. 3 interlocked circles around a cross that wasn't quite a cross. The chain on the ledger wore that sigil. So did, I realized then, 2 of the brass cups that housed the corridor lamps. The building had been quietly tattooed by whoever believed that symbol mattered. The entries with the sigil were different. The left columns listed dates and places with their usual piety to sequence. The central narratives were not of men and women, but of rooms, books, maps, letters. Intervention performed on Annalise Minor, Rome, lower reading room. Right applied to itinerary of relic procession. Siena, Municipal Archive. Corrective blessing, enacted on printed broadside, regarding star positions observed on March. The ellipsis was ink, not absent memory. The hand had trailed off, as if someone had entered the room, or as if the pen had learned that not all lines are meant to be finished. How do you exorcise a book? With what voice do you address paper? I imagined the steady tone of the presiding priest, the Latin filed to its official edge, the listeners nodding with relief, as the disorder of story yielded to the comfort of a corrected narrative. The rightmost column did not say oblatus in those lines. It said, always and with beautiful consistency, rectificatus, set right. What had been wrong? The stars? The route? The year? Or the memory of them? I turned a page and found the ledger arguing with itself. Marginalia, in a different ink, older perhaps, or simply more tired, threaded the outer edges. The handwriting leaned left, a sailor in a crosswind. It did not contradict, it cautioned. Do not remove more than the story can survive. Relocate grief, do not erase it. If you change the feast, provide a new hunger. Those notes read like a conscience, whispering to an office clerk. Beneath one rectificatus, a line had been drawn, and a single word had been added in that left-leaning hand. Periculum. Danger. I had a supervisor in those days, named Lorenzo, who smelled faintly of saffron and rain, and wore his kindness like a coat 2 sizes too small. He had once told me, while we catalogued damaged book clasps, that the archives were not monolithic. Even a wall, he said, is built of opinions. I did not understand him then. I thought opinion was a luxury, and the wall's job was to keep luxuries out. The left-leaning hand belonged to an opinion. It did not win, but it wrote enough that a stranger with a candle and a stolen crescent of wax could feel 3 corridors and 2 job descriptions later that a human being had once stood at this desk and worried correctly. On the 5th page of that section, the ledger's logic opened one more door. The entry did not name a person or a book or a route. It named a rumor. I recognized it. Rumors have long half-lives in cities built on bones and bravery. This one said that a certain relic had traveled secretly during a plague year to a city too frightened to speak its own fear aloud, and that a woman had touched the reliquary and her fever had fled as if ashamed. The ledger's account of the intervention was brief. Rumor redirected, names dissolved, event neutralized. The rightmost column did not bless the forgetting with oblitus or soothe it with rectificatus. It used, in a hand almost ludicrously calm, pacificatus, pacified. A rumor has more life than most documents. It breathes mouth to mouth. It hides in kitchens. It perfumes itself with cooking smells and alley-wet stone. It fords the gaps. Dignity refuses to cross. To pacify a rumor is to win a small war against a city's blood. I closed my eyes and saw the woman's hands, the reliquary's glass, the sweat on her lip. The moment when a household's panic breaks into laughter because the fever has chosen a different house to inhabit. I saw hands grab the story, pin it by its wrists, speak Latin over it, file it in a ledger, stamp a seal, and one seal broke and slid into a sleeve and became my problem. What did it cost to pacify a rumor? Which hunger had to be fed to make the neighborhood accept the replacement story? The left-leaning hand had tried to say, "Relocate grief, do not erase it." Maybe they failed. Maybe the neighborhood built new grief out of the silence and placed it on the wrong doorstep. People are ingenious about grief. If you deny them the truth, they will freight the nearest object with meaning until it collapses under a weight it never earned. I should tell you about the drawers. They line the far wall like the faces of 100 trustworthy men, wooden, modest, interchangeable. Each bears a number, not a name. Each opens with the shy scrape of a childhood secret. I knew those drawers the way a doctor knows his instruments, by touch and the peculiar music of wood against wood. On the ledger's margin, beside certain entries, there were numbers written small enough to be ashamed of themselves. I matched one to a drawer 37. Inside, ribbon cut into lengths of 3 inches, dyed a red that had decided not to be bright, and a collection of small circular impressions pressed into thin lead, as if a ring had been impatient and made its mark multiple times to learn how it looked under different pressures. The lion with a padlock heart appeared among them, always slightly blurred, as if the lion disapproved of being displayed without ceremony. Drawer 52, cross-referenced to a line where event neutralized concluded an exorcism of a rumor, held a hair under glass, a single golden thread. Hair is stubborn, it outlives vows. It tells stories to microscopes that men will not tell their confessors. The note under the glass, "My Latin will not flatter you," read. Attribution, reassigned to anonymous mercy. The saint's name that had been attached to the rumor's relief had been cut away like a tag from an expensive garment, and the garment put on a mannequin labeled simply "Goodness." It is harder to venerate goodness without a face. That is, perhaps, the point. I am not innocent. I felt the thrill of trespass so cleanly in those minutes that I could have poured it into a chalice. But I also felt the ache of a small, neglected muscle begin to wake the muscle that lifts a question and refuses to put it down just because the room prefers quiet. What if exorcism, as recorded here, was not the casting out of darkness, but the casting out of discrepancy? What if the most dangerous thing in those corridors was not evil, but a particularly disciplined tidiness applied to the past? I turned the page again and found a place where the obedient hand had made a mistake. It had written a name in the witness column that had been officially erased from calendars. A saint whose canonization had been not merely rescinded but eaten, her day given to a man who wore a martyrdom better. A straight line obliterated the name. Over it, a smaller correction in coppery ink replaced it with "Anonymous Sister." The left-leaning hand did not comment. Silence can be a margin note too. An archivist should leave a trail for his future self. I left none, or perhaps I left the wrong kind. I did not mark my pages with slips of ribbon. I did not dog-ear. I did not copy lines. I tried to memorize a texture, a flavor, the way the candlelight nibbled at the tails of certain letters. I told myself that memory was safer than paper, because no one could confiscate it without first noticing my skull. That is the sort of joke men tell themselves when their courage does not reach the fingertips. My fingertips shook anyway. The candle's flame broadened and thinned with my breath, like a patient learning how to speak after a long silence. After an hour, I use hour as a courtesy to the world's expectations. I closed the ledger and let the chain fall into place gently so that it would not protest and bring a busier kind of attention. I rose. My knees sounded like old furniture. I walked the corridor to a door with no name. It is not a magical door, not one that conceals golden stairs or tongues of fire. It hides catalogues. Inside, the air tastes faintly of wool and paste. There, a man can pretend he is safe, because the spines are labeled and the drawers hold cards, and every card lives in a small republic of coordinates. I found the drawer that corresponded to the ledger's shelf mark and slid it open. The cards were a decade old at their youngest. The ledger's entry was there, its accession number, a row of digits so polite you would invite them to dinner. No mention of sigils, no mention of the rightmost column, no mention of the drawer cross-references. The card might have been written by a man who knew only the spine's width. I did a small, wicked thing. I added a dot with my pencil. After the call number, a dot I knew meant further inquiry. It was a private superstition among the night staff. It was supposed to remind us, on bleak mornings when everything felt like dust and not one breath of the basilica's music reached below, that some objects deserve to be returned to, not for duty, but for the sort of satisfaction that does not depend on approval. I pushed the drawer shut, and the wooden rasp sounded like a small animal scurrying toward safety. On my way back, I met Sister M. In the corridor, the same initial as in the ledger, though either there are many M's in the world or Providence has a vulgar sense of humor. She is the kind of woman the church produces when it is at its best. Practical as bread, unsentimental as rain, eyes that have seen every variety of hypocrisy and still look for usefulness. "Cold tonight," she said, and her breath proved it. I nodded. She glanced at the candle in my hand and then at the door behind me. "Some rooms," she said, "are only warm if the people in them tell the truth." She did not stop. She did not look back. To this day, I do not know if we were speaking about the same room. Back at the desk, I opened the ledger one last time because objects that wait deserve courtesy. The page I had left displayed that compromised word again, the one whose first letter was not O. I pressed my finger lightly against the ridged vellum as another man's hesitation rode up into my skin, across time like an elevator with a broken bell. The S did not grow clearer. It grew inevitable. I did not yet know the rest of the word. I would learn it later, the way we learn all the important words in a room that demands payment. Silence was sacred, they had told me when I was newer and happier and more easily flattered by the robes of men who mispronounced my last name. Silence keeps the church from shattering on every stone of scandal. Silence, I now suspected, kept the church from hearing itself. There is a difference between secrecy and privacy. Secrecy hides rot. Privacy protects tenderness. The ledger practiced secrecy with the tidiness of a man who irons his socks. Tenderness well. Tenderness never asks for a column to be added. I replaced the chain, which was more like laying a sleeping dog across a blanket than like locking a door. I brought the candle's flame close to the missing seal's scar. Wax does not heal. It simply stops insisting. The scar watched me. I touched the cuff where the stolen crescent of wax had made a home against my pulse. I told myself a story, another priestly habit. The story was that I had preserved a fragment for the sake of future repair, that I was a temporary custodian of something that must be made whole. The truth is that I could not stand the thought that every absence in this building had been authored and that none of them could be reversed. The small weight in my sleeve said, "Not all at once." Before leaving, I did the one thing that transforms observation into confession. I said a name again. Not the child's this time, but the name of a street with a bakery, and the name of the woman who still put an extra heel into a bag out of a theology more ancient than canon. I said the name of a janitor I had known who taught me how to listen for a broken hinge and died without a mass because no one noticed he had never asked for one. I said under my breath and into the candle's patient ear the name of a saint whose day had been confiscated and replaced with anonymous mercy. The room did not change. The basilica above did not pause its breath. The ledger did not tremble. Perhaps something in me sat up straighter. On the way out, I tested the locks, the way a compulsive man tests the stove before bed. The third stair door consented again. The second door, which honors speed over ceremony, snapped shut as if proud of its efficiency. I climbed. My knees did not complain this time. On the landing, a draft lifted the candle's flame onto its toe and set it down again. The hallway gave me back to the night, like a letter slid under the right door at last. I would like to tell you that I slept then, and that angels argued above my roof and left me messages scratched in frost on the window. That is not how truth behaves when it first learns your address. It knocks like a polite neighbor and asks for flour. It returns the cup. It asks again. It returns the cup again. You begin to look forward to the interruption. You pretend it is nothing. You find recipes that require flour. The next day, I found Lorenzo in the tool room, counting brass tacks, as if he were inventorying small pieces of sunlight. "Have you ever seen the lion with the padlock heart?" I asked, pretending ignorance. To pretend is to give someone a chance to choose their courage. He did not look up. "Depends on which lion you mean," he said. "Some lions roar, some guard. And padlocks?" I asked. He smiled without showing his teeth. "Padlocks are not for keeping what is bad out," he said. "They are for keeping a story from walking off by itself." He looked up then, finally, and his eyes did a thing I will never forget. They scanned my face as if reading a page under poor light. "Be careful which stories you rescue," he said. "They breed." I considered telling him about the oblitus column, about the way a pen can become a scalpel in the right or the wrong hand. I did not. Hospitality requires that we don't hand our guests more weight than they came prepared to carry. I expected, then, to carry this weight alone. That is not martyrdom. It is laziness in a heroic costume. A weight shared is not halved. It is clarified. I would learn that too late. Back below, the ledger resumed being a machine. It cannot care for the condition of its readers. It required my candle and my attention, and in return it gave me sentences shaved so carefully of drama that their remaining nouns and verbs gleamed like surgical tools. Saints' Day adjusted to better console the bereaved of the northern quarter. Procession route revised to avoid eclipse viewing. Catalog entry rewritten to remove confusing mention of duplicate pontiff. Duplicate, pontiff. The words lay there, as if they weren't dynamite at all, as if they were the sort of errand a boy does on a bicycle between school and supper. The right column, rectificatus, set right. I went to the drawers. Drawer 61 offered a signet ring cracked like a tooth. The emblem on it had been rubbed thin by a thumb that either loved or despised its work. The wedge missing from the ring's face matched, in its shape if not its material, the half-moon asleep in my cuff. The paper label said only, "No longer used." Tools are rarely retired for moral reasons. They are retired when a newer tool performs the same function with less fuss. I touched the ring and felt nothing at all, no heat, no portent, only the alloy's ancient boredom. Drawer 19 contained a page torn from a missal and annotated in the left-leaning hand. When altering a holy day, provide surrogate light candles in courtyards, bread ovens open to the street, bells rung for small reasons. I imagined a winter night when grief had been forcibly moved by administrative fiat from one day to another, and a neighborhood's hunger for ritual had to be fed anyway. So someone had opened an oven and let the heat become a feast that could not be filed under any name. I imagined the ledger's rightmost column struggling to categorize warmth. If this sounds to you like I was prescribing mercy to the very mechanism that graded it, then you understand my confusion. The ledger was not evil. It was a blade in a steady hand. Some cuts save lives. Some cuts remove the wrong organ. Both are tidy afterward. Both can be recorded with commas and satisfied columns. What frightened me was not the blade, but the confidence of the hand that would not admit its own tremor to the page. At some point, I realized I was hungry. The hunger felt dishonest, too ordinary for the scale of my indignation. I left the ledger closed, and the chain draped, and the candle settled into a posture that suggested endurance, and climbed to the refectory, where a light always burned because someone had decided that a building that eats must confess. Even at night, I buttered a heel of bread. I thought of the woman who always added one to my bag. The butter's salt made my mouth remember that all confessions begin in flesh. I chewed and listened to the basilica turn its huge, invisible shoulders in sleep. When I returned, the candle had not quite given up. Wax had overflown its lip and made a cooling lake that would later pry itself free like a lost continent and slide off the brass into my palm. When I was not ready, teaching me that warmth, too, demands attention. I set the wax aside where it could not surprise me and reopened the ledger. The next page began with a tiny hand-drawn compass rose in the upper left corner, as if a cartographer had grown impatient with the narrowness of exorcism and wanted to remind himself that elsewhere entire oceans waited. Beneath the rose, an entry unlike any other. Corrective rites applied to calendar to prevent eclipse from coinciding with funeral of a name I will not say. The name had been stroked out in ink so dark it reflected the candle like a small, terrible mirror. The rightmost column contained 2 words for the first time, rectificatus, and beneath it in the left-leaning hand, perditio, loss. I looked up as if the loss might be in the room, hiding in the shadow behind the desk or folded into the chair like a small boy. It wasn't, of course. The loss was not a noun in that sentence. It was a weather report. The man who wrote it had wanted the column to stop pretending that setting things right did not cost anything. He wrote the price down, tiny and beautiful, and ignored. I placed my palm on the word. The vellum's warmth felt like a lie the candle told me to keep me polite. Footsteps in the corridor interrupted my study. The kind of footsteps that learn to take responsibility for their noise firm enough to be recognized, humble enough not to alarm. Lorenzo appeared in the doorway, his hair disarranged by a hat he must have lost somewhere between outside and here. He regarded the candle, then the ledger, then my hands. "That book," he said, "is heavier after midnight." It was neither a question nor a warning. It was a weather report of his own. "You know its language?" I asked. He shrugged. "I know its appetite," he said. "It prefers nouns to people." He left without entering, as if the threshold were a living thing that would bite him if he crossed it. I waited, Men in these rooms often wait for omens and call them instructions. None came. The candle argued briefly with a draught and then declared itself the victor. I leaned again over the page. In the lower margin, the left-leaning hand had allowed itself a rare flourish. If you move the holy, you must move the hungry. Otherwise, they will return to the old door and blame the dark. It is hard to describe what that line did to me. It was as if someone had cracked a window in a room that had long ago given up petitioning for air. The ledger's obedient hand continued its task untroubled above. But underneath, a voice wrote the world back in. There is a moment in every investigation where you become less interested in being right than in being exact. The ledger made an accountant of me. I wanted to count the erasures. I wanted to list the redirected rumors, the adjusted skies, the saints with reassigned miracles, the streets whose grief had been made to walk next door and dress itself in another neighborhood's clothing. I wanted to see if the numbers meant anything. Numbers often provide the illusion of an answer, when what we hunger for is the permission to keep asking. I began a private index, dates with sigils, entries with pacified rumors, pages where the compass rose appeared, corrections that had cost someone the courage to write perditio. On a separate slip, because I am not completely reckless, I wrote a list of drawers to revisit. 37, 52, 61, 19. The numbers began to feel like names. I returned to the ledger, and in the blankness beneath a line where the rightmost column had not yet received its verdict, I saw again the ghost of that S. It wasn't my imagination. The S belonged to a word I did not yet deserve to write. I would later. Before that, there were other pages to turn. Before that, the building had to teach me what it meant by memory. When finally I closed the book that night or morning, or whatever the corridor had decided to call it, I did the small prayer the older keepers had taught me, the one not in any missal, the one that is less a prayer than a habit of gratitude. I placed my hand flat on the cover and said, "Enough for now." It was a way of telling myself that no discovery is worth the destruction of the body that found it, that breath and bread and the kindness of a colleague matter as much as the clean satisfaction of a page turned and understood. It was an apology to a machine for treating it like a person, and an apology to a person for treating him like a machine. I replaced the chain, this time with just a little more tenderness than before, the way one tucks in a child after realizing you have scolded him for a crime he did not commit. I lifted the keyring. It approved, chiming its small, indifferent bell. I took the candle and gave it to the corridor, which has always loved drama and therefore pretends not to notice small lights. The third stair lifted me like a shrug. The second stair released me like a secret learned too late. The first stair asked me, with unseemly politeness, to return. On the final landing, I did not blow the candle out. I cupped it and carried it through the last door into the courtyard, and let the Roman night make a softer kind of darkness around us both. The dome shouldered the sky like a promise. I held the wax fragment in my sleeve until the heat of my wrist convinced it I was not an enemy. I whispered the names again, the baker's wife, the janitor, the anonymous sister, the child, and discovered that the candle flame steadied when I spoke them, as if names were the right sort of wind. In time, I would learn that the ledger could catalogue an exorcism of an event with the same practiced elegance it brought to the exorcism of a terrified boy in a provincial bedroom. I would learn that a wax seal can be a theology and a weapon, that a ring can write history without ever touching a page, that a rumor, properly pacified, leaves a hunger that meals cannot fill. I would learn the missing word that begins with S, and the cost of writing it in a column that had been trained to accept only one verdict. But that night, this night of the third stair, and the ledger's second invitation, I learned something smaller, and for me, more dangerous. I learned that my memory was not for sale, and that the price of keeping it would not be paid in spectacles and headlines, but in quiet winters and carefully uttered names. I set the candle on my windowsill beside the red crescent of wax flecked with gold. The two of them pretended not to know each other, the way conspirators behave at a bus stop. Dawn braided itself into the edge of the glass. I did not sleep so much as fold myself into a promise and rest there, like a bookmark between chapters. When I closed my eyes, the ledger's columns marched in the dark, tidy as monks, tireless as the tide. I saw the left-leaning hand and its small rebellions. I heard Lorenzo's voice, counting sunlight in brass tacks. I smelled the corridor's honest cold. I felt the third stair underfoot, not as stone, but as a sentence I had finally learned how to read. And in the margin that the world leaves around every day, if you look hard enough, I wrote a word I had not yet earned, but which had begun, nevertheless, to choose me. Remember, the rumor among the night staff was simple enough to laugh at in daylight. The calendar upstairs does not always agree with the calendar downstairs. We told it with a shrug, passing the sugar, as if gossip about time were the same as gossip about a new security guard's haircut. But at night, when the basilica above translated prayer into pressure and the corridors below smelled of vellum and old iron and the patient bitterness of glue, the rumor stopped being a joke and became a set of instructions. Count twice, walk slowly. Listen for the place where the echo arrives before the sound. I started to notice it in small betrayals. Bells that should have rung at the quarter hour rang at the 3/8, as if the tower had learned some private arithmetic. A clock with a crack through its porcelain face kept perfect time only when I turned my back to it. The dust settled in patterns that looked exactly like the shadow of noon, even when it was obviously long past midnight. These are not proofs. They are symptoms. The body of a building registering a fever that men prefer to call weather. One corridor, narrow and honest, refused to keep its end in the same century as its beginning. I discovered this by accident, the way children discover that a river has a stronger current under the surface. I set a candle on the floor and watched the wax collapse in one direction as the flame leaned toward a draft. Then I walked 30 paces and set it down again, and the wax leaned the other way, toward a different draft that did not exist. I wrote this in my little notebook and tried not to write the thought that came uninvited. There is a wind that comes not from air but from counting. In the ledger, the entries changed tone when the work shifted from people to days. The earlier pages were storms with names and addresses. The later pages were weather with verbs. 8th day removed for consolation. Feast relocated to prevent concurrence with calamity. Eclipse unannounced to preserve sleep in the quarter of the bereaved. The handwriting did not tremble. The ink did not accuse. The rightmost column, so faithful to oblatus when a boy cried out in a dark room, offered a different piety here. Rectificatus set right. If time stumbles, the hand suggested, a gentleman adjusts the carpet. I turned those pages with my breath held, as if lungs might be the mechanism by which time advanced. There is a theory whispered in places that fear daylight, that centuries have been inserted like extra leaves in a hymn book to make the music come out even. I don't know whether that theory is true the way arithmetic is true. I know the handwriting that argued for certain adjustments used the tender grammar of pastoral care. If the funeral falls under an eclipse, one marginal note counseled, mothers will read a doom into the sky that will live longer than their grief. Move the sky. It did not sound like tyranny when I read it there in the candlelight. It sounded like a man trying to keep a city from waking to colder mornings than it can stand. But compassion offered at scale becomes machinery. Machinery needs fuel. In the drawer marked with a number that matched a page where the eclipse was moved, I found a thin wooden template used to scrape and redraw the calendar's grid onto a fresh vellum. The edges were smoothed by fingers that needed forgiveness for their competence. I touched the template and felt how easily neatness becomes a sacrament. The left-leaning hand appeared along that page's margin again, a sailor bracing. If you move the sky, give the people a new lamp. Upstairs, the official story had always been astronomy. A precise church corrects a sloppy sun. A mature calendar replaces an inconvenient one. Sailors rejoice. Crops align their obedience to the moon with Rome's to the season. The downstairs story was different. It was pastoral, move this feast to feed them after their dead are buried. It was theatrical, avoid the spectacle of omen. It was administrative, reduce the variance between the story and the schedule. It was, above all, quiet. The ledger did not need to persuade anyone who did not already know how to read it. One night, the building performed its lesson with more candor than usual. I had left the third stair and walked the long corridor to a room whose door frame carried 7 notches at ankle height, a harmless graffiti of caretakers counting years. I set the candle down and watched its flame argue with a draft that might have been the sigh of a sleeping archivist in another wing. I opened a narrow cabinet and found pinned under 2 brass tacks a single sheet that had been scraped and re-inked, a palimpsest of days. Under the new calendar, faint but legible if the candle leaned just so, there was an older shape. Feast days shifted by a week, a saint's vigil relocated 2 days forward as if to meet a grief halfway, and a Sunday that had been exchanged with a Wednesday like 2 children swapping chairs. I did not rejoice or complain. I felt the oddest sensation instead. It was as if I were a tailor, discovering that the jacket I wore had been let out at the seams in the night while I slept, and that my body had learned the new fit without ever being asked. It did not feel like conspiracy. It felt like the maintenance of a building that has decided it must shelter its inhabitants even if it must tell longer stories to itself to do it. When I closed the cabinet, the door rasped its breath and sent a small gust across the back of my hand. The candle sputtered. The flame steadied. I said out loud to the empty room, "I understand what you think you are doing." The room replied, as rooms do. It admitted my voice to its list of things that had happened and put me in the correct drawer. The ledger's pages that dealt with time had other peculiarities. They carried tiny compass roses, sketched by a hand that needed direction to exist on paper. They used verbs I had not met in the rituals for bodies: pacify, redirect, translate, diminish. One of the strangest entries documented the exorcism not of a person but of a midnight. The description was brief. Midnight held too long, children wept at unnatural dawn. Bells corrected, merchants compensated. The rightmost column, obedient and smug, wrote rectificatus. The left-leaning hand below dared a second line, perditio, childhood, loss, childhood. The ledger did not argue, because ledgers do not argue. They record victories and totals and balance. You will say to me, calendars change. The Julian becomes Gregorian. Errors accumulate and are corrected. The planet refuses to keep time with our syllables. A century is adjusted with a carpenter's patience. Yes, but upstairs, when such facts entered conversation, it was astronomy. Downstairs, it was hunger. It was a widow's threshold that needed a lantern. It was a street full of men who would not listen to the sermon if the sky shouted in a different key. It was a neighborhood that could swallow a miracle whole and digest it into superstition if someone didn't put an official word in the right place at the right hour. The rumor said that if you stayed past matins at the wrong end of the wrong corridor, the lamps stretched your shadow into a century you never lived through. I tested this, not because I believed it, but because I was tired of not believing things that nevertheless behaved like weather. I stood with my back to the door and faced a lamp whose brass cup had been polished to the pallor of the moon. The corridor narrowed to the left. It widened to the right. I lifted my right hand and watched my shadow lift its left. That was expected. Then I took 3 steps toward the narrowing. The shadow hesitated, and for a moment so small it might have been made of dust motes, my hand and its argument with light did not agree where we were. I felt nothing, no vertigo, no mystical authority, only the particular scorn of stone contending with human posture. I backed up, and the shadow obeyed again. Science could explain this, I'm sure, with diagrams about angles and candle height and the curve of the wall. The ledger would have done something else. It would have written, interventus, minimized omen, intervention, minimized omen. In a cabinet with a different index, I found a small stack of printed broadsides, eclipses predicted and eclipses remembered. A neat hand had circled certain dates and written in the margin, "Nolite annuntiare," do not announce. The ledger cross-referenced those broadsides to pages where funerals did not collide with spectacles. I do not know whether the people slept better for it. I know that sleep was the stated objective more often than theology. Let the quarter sleep. Do not let the children count backwards. Delay joy until morning has had its bread. Pastoral, again. Administrative, relentlessly. Lorenzo brought me a scarf that week, ridiculous in color, defiant as a parakeet. Wear it, he said, so your blood does not waste its time hating your hands. Then, as if the scarf had been the price of his honesty, he added, be careful where you count. Some rooms count you back. He never told me which rooms. He did not need to. The third stair counted me back with a patience that made me feel both welcomed and weighed. Late in the week, I reached a page where the ledger stopped pretending the sky was just scenery. The entry began with a miniature script so tiny I had to lift the candle dangerously close. Annus corrigendus year to be corrected. The narrative beneath laid out in a series of dignified lines, a plan. Feast days displaced, fasts redistributed, the long sorrow of a famine disguised behind a festival designed to redistribute food with the face of gratitude instead of the palm of charity. The rightmost column wrote rectificatus one more time. Then a second hand, smaller even than the left-leaning sailor, almost childlike, added a velvet word, debitum, debt. Whose debt? To whom? The book had answers to questions I knew better than to ask out loud, but this time it offered only the awareness that an adjustment, however compassionate, had been charged to someone's account. I imagined debtors collecting in the margins of history, like the poor at a side door, waiting for the kitchen to remember them. In a drawer, cross-referenced to that page, was a coin pouch containing 5 Roman coins, all stamped with emperors whose faces had learned how to be stern for so long that sternness had become their only expression. A note said, "For compensation when the bell refuses to admit its error. Bells, like men, can learn the habit of being right." I grew bold enough to ask Sister M a question. "Do you ever feel," I said, keeping my voice surrendered to the corridor's hush, "that the days do not always fit?" She tied a bundle of string with the competence of a field medic. "Shoes do not always fit," she said, "but you still walk." "And blisters?" I asked. She smiled without exposing the small pain behind her eyes. "We call them penances," she said, "so that no one feels obliged to fix the shoes." She brushed past me, and the draft from her passing told the candle a secret. The flame steadied in gratitude. There are people who walk through rooms, persuading small lights not to despair. The ledger kept its own counsel. The oblitus column returned when the subject was people. The rectificatus column reigned when the subject was calendars. Between them sat a page that made me consider both habits at once. It described the removal of a saint's name from a day that had gathered too much private grief. The language was clinical. Attribution reassigned to anonymous mercy. The rightmost column wrote rectificatus. The left-leaning hand did not resist. At the bottom of the page, however, in a place where ink rarely strayed, a single hair was trapped under a scab of sealing wax, a pale thread that caught the candle's light and argued for a person behind the policy. I do not know whose hair it was. I know it raised the temperature of the room by the exact degree required to allow tears to form without freezing into rhetoric. On that same page, the obedient hand recorded the exorcism of a duplicated pontiff. The phrase was printed with the lazy confidence of a clerk noting a shipment. I stood up from the desk, because sitting felt disrespectful to whatever that line had cost the man who had written it. How do you exorcise a second pope from a story without throwing your back out of joint? The rightmost column, dull in its victory, wrote rectificatus. The left-leaning hand wrote nothing. Silence again, not as absence, but as a margin note too large to fit on the page. The drawers offered a signet ring with its face cracked and a card that said, almost cheerful, no longer used. I stared at the ring and thought of substitute teachers and borrowed names, and the way a city learns to pronounce a lie politely if you give it enough opportunities to practice. When the building wanted to scold me for my indignation, it sent me to a room with maps. I obeyed. The floor was tiled in stars, mosaic fractured by repairs that took their dignity more seriously than their accuracy. The map on the wall was not of land but of feast days arranged like constellations, connected by lines too faint to read unless you knew already what they wished to say. A thin inscription at the bottom, no larger than a thumbnail, whispered, "When Orion kneels, open the 13th step." Orion does not kneel. He is a world that demands to be seen upright, forever chasing, forever armed. And yet the mosaic showed him on one knee, a posture of contrition or proposal or exhaustion. It is possible someone had given him that posture to instruct the floor more gently than a sign could do. On the night when the belt dips there by a finger's width, take the other staircase, the one with the shallow rise. It is also possible that humility had been edited onto the sky to keep a neighborhood from arguing with a sermon. In that room, I stood long enough that my knees made their furniture noises when I finally, Saturday, The candle showed me what it had hidden from me a minute before. Footprints, faint but numerous, in a powder the color of flour. Choristers pass that way on certain nights, instructed to keep their eyes down to prove obedience. Children know how to count without numbers. They count with feet. They had learned to cross the room without waking the lion whose heart was a padlock. The rumor had another verse. If you stand at the center of that map at the right hour, the breath of the building will lift the hair on your arms, as if you stood at the edge of a cliff. I stood there because I had decided, somewhere between the ledger's rectificatus and the drawer's cracked ring, that I would prefer failing my own experiment to succeeding at someone else's instructions. I took the scarf from my neck and set it on the floor as a marker a child might trust. I closed my eyes and opened my hands and felt nothing dramatic, only the kind wind that blows in rooms that have been taught to keep secrets with the diligence of accountants. I opened my eyes to see the scarf move a quarter inch. I know how drafts behave. This one behaved with intention. It asked me to believe not in magic, but in the stubbornness of arrangements. When I returned to the ledger, it had turned itself to a page I had not yet reached. This is untrue in the world you inhabit as you read. Books do not move. It is true in the world where a man whose breath has begun to count like a monk's returns to a desk he wants to believe is still his. The page recorded interventions on anniversaries that risk reproducing unrest. The word reproducing made me laugh aloud, which made the candle shiver in alarm. Unrest as a parent, anniversaries as children. The ledger had a way of naming tendernesses into procedures. The rightmost column did a routine's work. The left-leaning hand wrote, tiny as remorse. If you move grief without telling it where to sit, it sulks. I had begun, by then, to think of time as a person in those rooms. Stubborn, old, a little vain, touchy about its dignity, grateful for company, manipulative as a favorite uncle, and capable, in its best moments, of a generosity that made the ledger's discipline look like an overcorrection. If you deliver bread to a household on the wrong day, but accompany it with a story good enough to fill the table's silences, the children will remember the story and not the date. The ledger wrote rectificatus. The children wrote their own calendar and laughter and learned hunger. The left-leaning hand worried in the margins. Replace, don't erase. It was well past the hour I used to call late, when footsteps appeared in the corridor again. Sister M, scarfed against a cold, even the building could not turn into a parable, stepped into the doorway and stood with her hands inside her sleeves, as if holding an unlit candle of her own. When I was a girl, she said, without inviting me to answer, we moved the Christmas pageant because the storm came a week early, and the old men said the roof would not be safe. We put the star on a coat rack and carried it anyway. The children loved it. The star did not mind. She looked at the ledger with the pity of a woman watching a grown man pretend a ruler can measure grief. Move what you must, she said, but count the children afterward. Then she left, and I knew that if I wrote her sentence into any margin, the vellum would revolt. I closed the ledger with a courtesy that had grown sincere. I folded the scarf Lorenzo had shamed my blood into accepting. I swept the floor lightly with a horsehair broom because the footprints deserved a respectful blur. At the door, I turned to say something that I could not translate into words that would not sound foolish, that I had learned how to let the building correct me. I said nothing. I locked the door, The lock said its syllable. The corridor gave me back my shadow without argument. Upstairs, dawn had set itself to the quiet work of changing minds. The sky was a lighter gray. The coins in my pocket did not jingle the same as they had when I arrived. I know that sentence is nonsense. I know also that it is the only accurate sentence for what occurred. The ledger had invited me to treat days as clay, and clocks as polite suggestions, and my hands had remembered, briefly, how to make a blessing out of a rearrangement. When I reached my apartment, I set the red crescent of wax beside the candle's cooled lake and tried to imagine the gesture that had broken the original seal. Not violence, not accident. A decision, those are the only three categories down there. Violence, accident, decision. The ledger existed to disguise one as the other. When circumstances demanded, I slept miserably, which is to say, I napped in shifts and listened to the radiators rust their prayers. When I woke, the room's light had the color of paper that has been folded and unfolded so often that it becomes obedient. I made coffee. I did not burn my tongue. The small mastery felt like a cheat code. I considered not going back. I considered respecting the boundary a braver man might call prudence. Then I put the scarf on because Lorenzo had told me to, and obedience, like rebellion, needs practice. Back in the corridor, the candle behaved like an ally again, correcting distances to the more humane scale that film crews try to fake and priests try to name. I did not test the shadow that night. I did not court the mosaic's wind. I did what men do when the truth is too large to face directly. I tidied. I refolded ribbon in drawer 37. I re-sleeved the cracked ring in 61. I adjusted the parchment's brace in the cabinet with the scraped calendar so that it would not collapse under its own history. I burned 3 letters that had no business outlasting the shame that authored them. The ledger approved each motion without comment, because ledgers approve everything that can be itemized. Only when I set my palm on its cover in the old wordless prayer did the ledger say anything I could translate. A slight flex under my hand, like a horse's shoulder admitting a rider. The admission was mechanical, not intimate. It meant, "You fit." That should have frightened me more than it did. Nothing is more dangerous than fitting exactly into a system that does not teach you how to exit. I lifted the cover anyway and counted the columns and let the small S at the edge of one blank verdict sit there and train the air between us, to hold its shape until the day came when the pen would finish the word and pay its cost. The rumor among the night staff still made me laugh in daylight. That is necessary. Laughter is how a city launder its dread. But at night, the laughter was replaced by something else. A steadying. A small refusal to be hurried by clocks that did not know the whole story. A willingness to wear the debt without pretending it wasn't written down somewhere in a hand neater than mine. If time stumbled, I would not shove it forward like a rude usher. I would lend it my shoulder and call the imbalance choreography. One last thing happened before the chapter of days could close itself. A boy 12, perhaps 13, all knees and questions, appeared at the edge of the corridor with a broom whose handle was taller than he was. He had the look children get when they have been told to be quiet without being told why. He never crossed the threshold. He whispered, as if secrets were a currency and I was rich enough to exchange them. Brother says if the bells are wrong, you count the names instead. Then he ran, leaving the broom to fall, with the soft despair of a tool that remembers better hands. I picked the broom up and leaned it on the wall so its loneliness would not become a superstition. I wrote the boy's sentence in my notebook because sometimes a city sends you a gospel written in a child's margins, and you would be a fool not to add it to your canon. If the bells are wrong, count the names. I said 4 names into the corridor: the baker's wife, the janitor, the anonymous sister, the child, and the building, which prefers the measured politeness of the liturgy, allowed itself an indiscretion. The candle flame stood straighter, and somewhere the cold lifted by less than a degree, which was exactly the right amount for gratitude. After that, the work of time returned to its recess. The ledger resumed being a book. The drawers closed without protest. The chain lay the way chains lie when they are tired of metaphors. I climbed the stairs and let the city tell its own mourning. It did so with buses and scooters, and the gossip of pigeons, and the smell of bread deciding that it could, after all, become breakfast. I did not decide anything dramatic. I chose a modest courage, to learn the word that begins with S when it was offered honestly, to pay the debt where I could, to move one lamp to a darker landing for a week when the funeral procession wound below it, not because the ledger had ordered me, but because I had finally learned to read the fear it could not catalogue. Time stumbles. That is not a crisis down there. It is a liturgy. We are taught to count. Then we are asked, gently or roughly, to forgive the counting. The ledger forgave nothing. It recorded. The left-leaning hand forgave something, sometimes, in the margins only. Between them, a man tried to keep a city sleeping when it must and waking when it can stand the sight of itself. I went home and slept like a person who had carried a map all night and only at dawn admitted that he had been walking in his own neighborhood the entire time. I did not set out to become a cartographer of vanished things. It happened the way ivy happens, slowly, persistently, indifferent to whether the wall approves. The ledger had taught me the grammar of days. Now the building made a quieter proposal. Learn the grammar of places. It began with a drawer that smelled faintly of damp wool and dried orange peel, an old librarian's cologne, and inside it a stack of thin portfolios tied with ribbon the color of tired wine. On the cover of the first, written in a hand that had taught itself to be invisible, a single word: itineraria, routes. The maps within were not maps the way tourists understand them. No pastel rivers or flamboyant borders, no banners with rampant lions. These were practical pilgrim sheets. A city cut into a bread loaf, slices numbered, alleyways sketched as ribs, little crosses where a man should pause to say a prayer or catch his breath. In the margin, where a modern printer would add a corporate logo, the left-leaning hand had written, almost shyly, "Silence is part of the route." It wasn't a piety, it was a warning. Certain streets punish conversation with a rumor that does not belong to you. One sheet had been scraped and re-inked so many times that the vellum showed a history of decisions as faint as the veins on the back of a hand. The oldest layer, if the redness of the iron gall was any guide, sent the pilgrim past a bakery that I knew, and a fountain where water bit the tongue with the taste of old coins. The next layer, paler, bent the path around 2 corners and sent the walker into a corridor of workshops where brass sang its thin songs. The newest line strolled past the basilica's flank as if doing nothing more momentous than escorting a child to school. In the ledger, cross-referenced to this map, the note was scandalously simple: procession route revised to pacify grief. The rightmost column wrote rectificatus. The left-leaning hand scribbled, "Pay the baker for loaves left unblessed." Has Mostin. I ran my finger along the oldest root and felt the way the ink had sunk deeper into the vellum there, as if a road made by feet can teach paper to keep the memory of pressure. Behind me, on a shelf that preferred to be ignored, a chained book sighed in the draft. The sigh wasn't metaphor. It was the small shift a large object makes when it resigns itself to being noticed. I turned, half apologizing, and faced a binding that had retired from indifference. It was pale, the color of milk left in a window too long, its corners bitten by a century's appetite. 2 iron staples held the chain to the spine, as if pinning a wound closed. The title had been rewritten 3 times, each new dignity scratching out the last: Hagiographia, Parva, Little Lives of Saints, then Vitae Correctae, Lives Corrected, and finally, a phrase with more scruple than honesty: Catalogus Nominae Obscuritae, a catalogue of obscured names. If a book blushes, it does so in smell rather than color, and this one had the delicate embarrassment of lavender long past its season. I unlocked the clasp with the key that knew its stutter, and pulled the cover open, expecting to find pieties. Instead, I found receipts. A saint's life in those pages looked like a ledger with footnotes, miracles listed like inventory, dates as tidy as a grocer's. In the margins, in that left-leaning hand, injunctions so careful they read like apologies: move feast to calmer wind, attribute rescue to neighbor's hands, to avoid spectacle, erase her surname, fear cannot pronounce what it cannot spell. A thin wax wafer had trapped a single hair at the corner of one folio, a pale, defiant curve. The main hand had annotated, with the innocence only an obedient pen can muster, relic contamination. The left-leaning hand wrote beneath, "Relic is a life, not a thing." I ran across a name I knew, not because the church had taught me to say it, but because a woman in a village once pressed a cookie into my palm and whispered that her grandmother had sworn by this saint for girls with fevered foreheads. The official calendar had no such person. The catalogue here did, for a while. Then her feast was reassigned to anonymous mercy, and her miracles scattered like a flock harried by a polite dog. Attribution reassigned, the ledger would have said. The catalogue was less triumphant. It listed the towns where her day had been kept in stubborn kitchens long after the basilica stopped announcing her name. A pencil line, impoverished, practical, ran through those towns like a thread. Someone had tried to mend what policy had unstitched. There were maps drawn not of streets but of shelves, the kind of internal atlas that keeps a building's mind from misplacing itself. On one, beside a rectangle labeled Apocrypha, permit C, a small square had been drawn and then rubbed nearly out, as if the author had wanted to confess a cupboard and then thought better of it. I lifted the sheet to the candle, and the square returned, a ghost returning to the scene of its erasure. In that cupboard, its real counterpart, not the inkling, lay a folio, cloth-wrapped and indecently humble. No title, no boast, a penciled number on its corner, as if it had once been a prop in a play. The cloth stuck to itself with the tackiness of old paste. I peeled it back and found a gathering of pages stitched with thread the color of ash. On the first page, a preface in a hand that did not belong to either of my familiar scribes, rounder, younger, a little vain. It read, "To those who must move stories, as one moves furniture, do no harm in the night that you would not claim in daylight." It was not a warning, it was a dare, disguised as a prophylactic. The text that followed concerned what it called the chain of telling. If 3 copies of a story exist, and 2 are removed, the last becomes a relic, and relics attract commerce. Do not create relics carelessly, the page advised. Trade surrounds them. In the margin, the left-leaning hand had answered like an impatient tutor. Trade surrounds everything. Teach honesty at the door. Across from that, in minuscule ink, the color of grief, a third voice so small I had to trespass with the candle to read it, added, "Honesty at the door dies when the door is moved." I replaced the folio and let the cupboard take it back, as if I were returning a tool to a neighbor with whom I was not yet ready to share names. The room held its breath, with the prim satisfaction of a hostess who has convinced herself the awkward guest will not return. I turned instead to a cabinet of small drawers that historians, I have come to believe, all eventually imitate in their sleep. Drawer 12 contained seals, their impressions rolled into lead like wet footprints, a gallery of emblems so impatient to survive that they had stamped themselves repeatedly on whatever soft surface forgave the force. There was the lion with a padlock for a heart, sulking even in profile, a hand plucking a feather from a wing, guilty and proud, a cross that wasn't quite a cross, and one I had not seen, a fish whose eye was a keyhole. The label beneath that one said, only, "For use in waters. Lowe's. Lowe's." The ledger's cross-reference led me to drawer 29, a map of the Tiber with tiny X marks at the places where, if one were to discard a small object of particular authority, the current could be trusted to pocket it. A note, in that uncompromising, obedient hand, announced, "Ring retired." The left-leaning hand, loyal to small mercies, wrote, "Bless the fishers." I thought of rings traveling the river's green patience, of boys finding them years later, with nets and inventing new churches on sandbars. In the back corner of the map room stood a lectern designed to humiliate posture. It forced even tall men to bow. There, under a sheet of glass that had learned how to forgive fingerprints, lay a chart whose ink shone like oil on water. It depicted no place I knew and every place I loved. Cities were constellations. Constellations were cities. Routes crossed at the intersections of song. In the lower right, almost playful, the left-leaning hand had drawn a compass, rose and labeled the cardinal points, not north, south, east, and west, but bread, water, fire, names. "If you must get lost," a note said, "hold to the names." I stood there a long time, longer than the candle wanted, watching my breath cloud the glass and then rewrite the chart a fraction with each slow exhale. Behind me, the chained book of obscured names waited with the patience only metal learns. The ledger, back in its room, waited too, with the patience only a machine learns. In my sleeve, the red crescent of wax rested against my pulse like a small sin pretending to be a relic. I put my palms flat on the glass over bread and names and made a promise that felt, even as I formed it, like stealing. I would not let a map become a muzzle. It is not heroic to make such a vow in private. It is procrastination with liturgical posture. Still, vows have a way of altering breath. I turned from the chart and went hunting for the thing that had been whispering at the edge of my hearing since I opened the first portfolio. An atlas tiled across a floor like a mosaic prayer rug. I found it where floorboards learned a new accent, the passage between two rooms whose air disagreed about humidity. The tiles were cool as coins. Stars marched in orderly disarray. Domes rose where stars should be. Pilgrim routes stitched themselves to constellations with thread so pale it hid from proud eyes. In the corner, a line of text no larger than a fingernail. When Orion kneels, open the 13th step. I knelt because the room asked, not because Orion had. Up close, the tile revealed a second language. Small circles hid under dark glaze, the way wells hide in courtyards when no one is thirsty. I pressed one with my thumb. It yielded a fraction, a courtesy given in recognition of a secret shared. I pressed another. It refused, and my thumb learned humility. I pressed a third and felt, under the tile, a warmth dulled by centuries. I lifted the candle low, and the flame discovered a seam I had missed. The 13th step was not a stair after all, but a trick of floor and breath and habit. It was a hatch. The building, disliking melodrama, had asked the stars to keep its secret modestly. I did not open it. There are doors whose morality is in the timing, not the turn. Instead, I marked the seam in my little notebook with the indecent abbreviation the night staff used for "come back when you deserve it." Then I sat cross-legged on the mosaic and read the city like a sky. Each route had been drawn, and then redrawn, and then corrected again, a palimpsest of kindness and control. Here, a spare line detoured a procession away from a corner where grief had learned to shout. There, a loop added a visit to a bakery on a morning when the ovens needed to be emptied for the poor, without teaching the rich to recognize generosity and mask it as policy. And in the ledger, always the rightmost column providing tidy closure, rectificatus. Set right, the left-leaning hand muttered, in letters as weary as bones. Set right for whom? The catalogue of obscured names had an index at the back, as shameless as a confession. It listed not the saints, but the places that had kept them in defiance of the official calendar. My village appeared, disguised by a Latin ending. So did an alley that does not show up on any modern tourist application but whose cobbles are as argumentative as old men. I traced a fingertip across those letters and felt the wick of the candle cower at my breath. These are not rebellions, the left-leaning hand lectured in the margin. They are immune responses. The obedient hand had underlined, reassigned to anonymous mercy. I wanted to steal a pen and write, give her back her name. I wanted to write it on every page until the paper burned. I did not. The ledger taught the discipline of not shouting at machines. It taught the art of the footnote that refuses to die. I returned the chained book to its sullen dignity and turned to a narrow shelf with no label at all, a shelf that had learned invisibility not as a trick but as a theology. There, a codex with a sick spine lay sideways, its pages warping like a man's memory, after he tells the same lie too often. I coaxed it to the desk and opened it with the patience of a physician unlearning his arrogance. The script within was familiar, in the way a dead language is familiar. You recognize its posture, even if its verbs refuse you. Along the gutter, between gatherings, a series of pinholes marched, binding marks. The pattern was wrong. Someone had removed a gathering and resewn the book to pretend it had always been this modest. In the ledger, I found the cross-reference. Intervention performed on Sermo 13 to prevent confusion. The rightmost column, complacent, rectificatus. The left-leaning hand bless, that sailor wrote. Confusion is sometimes the only honest verb for grace. What had Sermo 13 said? The remaining sermons dressed piety in strong verbs: feed, visit, untie, kneel, look up. The missing one's absence made the air around it ache like a socket after a tooth. In drawer 7, a sliver of parchment sat labeled, "From spine waist." On it, a single phrase survived the knife. The blessing that charges no debt. It was little. It was everything. I had learned enough by then to know that the building had a sense of humor so dry it cracked lips. It proved it by giving me, on the shelf above, a book with a gilded title, Manual for the Correct Enumeration of Mercies. Inside, a list of instructions, how to count kind acts so that they balanced the ledgers of confession without inspiring the populace to attempt too many on their own, and thereby confuse the hierarchy. The obedient hand had used it. Ticks marched in columns the way soldiers do when they think their officers still love them. The left-leaning hand had rarely visited these pages, but when it did, it wrote like a child in a margin, one word repeated under its breath. Enough, 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 1d2 1d. There were maps that lied by omission, and maps that lied by scale, and then there was the smallest map, a schedule assigning readers to rooms. On certain days, no one was scheduled for the room with chained books. On those days, public entries would later claim that a visitor had been given generous access under supervision. The ledger recorded the same day with prettier nouns, pacificatus rectificatus. In the personal index, I had begun a private insurrection, whose violence extended no farther than pencil. I drew a tiny square beside those dates and shaded it. The squares began to look like a city seen from above at night, a concentration of light that told you where fear had bought property. Sister M found me there, the candle laddering my face with little ropes of shadow, and stood a respectful distance away, as if waiting for my lungs to learn a slower choreography. "You are not the first to fall in love with invisible furniture," she said. "Maps you cannot show, names you cannot speak, drawers that hold their breath waiting for the right palm." She gestured at the chained book with a chin that had instructed novices and comforted widows. "Do you know why they chain books?" she asked. I gave the official answer: value, rarity, theft prevention. She shook her head, as a mother does when a child recites but does not understand. "Because books walk," she said, "and some rooms cannot afford honest feet." She left me with that condemnation disguised as kindness, and I went back to the atlas on the floor, and the hatch that was a 13th step, and the promise I was not yet worthy to claim. I wanted to open it. My fingers have bad manners around locks. But my ear remembered a small boy's sentence in a different corridor. "If the bells are wrong, count the names instead." I counted. The baker's wife, the janitor, the anonymous sister, the child whose fever had fled out of embarrassment, the saint erased and renamed Mercy to prevent the world from learning that grace sometimes picks favorites and that favoritism isn't a sin when it chooses the frightened. I counted until the counting stopped feeling like arithmetic and became the thing the ledger could never do, a litany. On my way out, I stopped at the cabinet with the river map and slipped the lead impression of the fish with keyhole emblem into my pocket, intending only to feel its weight. It felt uncommitted, all potential, like a word you have learned to pronounce but cannot yet define. I put it back. The ledger had taught me to pay before I took. The left-leaning hand had taught me to rename taking as borrowing when I could return more than I removed. I could not yet. At the threshold, the door frame asked for a tax in the currency of breath. One slow inhale, one honest exhale. I paid. The corridor admitted me to the less ceremonial arrogance of the stairs. On the landing, someone had chalked a tiny compass rose where street shoes could scuff it away. Its points read, bread, water, fire, names. Next to it, a childish hand had added a fifth point, skewed, eager, doors. I smiled in a way I had forgotten I could. The building, caught in the act of raising its own children, pretended not to notice. Back in my small apartment, I laid the notebook open and tried to pull a narrative through the beads of the day as if they were a rosary that refused to be prayed incorrectly. The maps lied kindly. The saints vanished politely. The chain made promises its iron could not keep. The ledger recorded, clean as a trimmed beard, the ways in which mercy had been disguised so that it would not embarrass policy. And yet, under the palimpsest, the oldest ink darkened when the candle leaned. In kitchens that census takers forgot, women still said the erased saint's name over simmering pots. Children, unsolvable by policy, drew stars where domes should be, and laughed the city into a shape the ledger could not fit into its columns. I slept, if it can be called that, with my hand around the little red crescent in my sleeve, the way a child sleeps with a toy whose gift outweighs its beauty. I dreamed a dream that was not mystical, and therefore felt more trustworthy. I pushed a pram through a library, and the pram contained sheets of vellum that refused to stop being alive. They wriggled and sighed and slept and woke and wanted milk. The librarian shushed me with that institutional tenderness recognizable in any language, and I whispered the names I had counted, and the sheets quieted as if soothed by recognition. When I woke, my hand smelled faintly of wax and orange peel and old lavender. Morning made the world smaller again, as it always does. Coffee grudged its heat into my cup. The street bullied my window with its scooters. At the door, I practiced the old habit of pretending to make a choice. Today, I told myself, I will avoid the map room. I will keep to inventories. I will file chain links and label brass cups and return a stack of hymnals to their more devout shelf. Then I put on Lorenzo's scandalous scarf and walked the route the oldest ink had taught my hand. A city is a map that plays dumb. The ledger is a city that learned to write. Between them, a man with a candle discovers that honesty is not a single light, but a constellation, and that some stars insist on kneeling so that small hands can reach them. When I reached the third stair, the lock performed its little theater of reluctance and then consented. The cool breathed its iron syllables. I did not hurry. The ledger waited, a machine clearing its throat. The chained book waited, a witness refusing to swear. The floor, Atlas waited, a sea pretending to be tile. I greeted each the way one greets old, difficult friends, with respect and the promise to listen more than I speak. And in the pocket of my sleeve, the wax crescent turned once against my pulse like a key deciding whether a door deserved its shape. The chapel was not on any schedule. Schedules are how a building admits it is mortal. This room had decided to live by a different arithmetic, one measured in withheld breaths and unhung clocks. A narrow door with a lintel too low for pride opened onto brick that drank light and returned it as doubt. The ceiling forced thought to stoop. The floors had learned to be quiet, in a way wood never quite manages. This was tile, old as a father's unfinished apology. Two nuns sat on either side of a woman whose palms faced the ceiling as if catching rain that no one else could feel. I was there because routine had betrayed me again. A brass cup had to be polished, a wick had to be trimmed, a chain sought oil, the kind of chores that keep a man safe from his own questions. But when I touched the doorknob, the cold climbed into my fingers like an instruction, and the ring of 12 keys my teacher of grammar made a different sound, the sound it makes when something in the building has decided to edit itself. The woman had the exhausted beauty of someone who does not have time to consider the subject. Her hair had been braided and unbraided and braided again so often that the plaits looked like arguments with a mirror. Ink on her forearms formed a hesitant script. Names, dates, a medical number, a single line of a hymn. Some had been lifted by chemicals, ghosted, rewritten. Under her skin ran a palimpsest of care, bureaucratic and desperate. She was saying a child's name, very softly, with the precision of a prayer that refuses spectacle. The two nuns did not shush her. They let the name braid the air. The presiding exorcist arrived without theater. He had learned to let silence do the introductions. His cassock was immaculate, without being vain. On his right hand, the ring, not decorative, not ancestral, a tool. I had felt its face before through a pocket of river and through the half-moon of wax that slept in my sleeve. The emblem was the same, a lion whose heart was a padlock. The lion's eye had been worn flat by a thumb that believed in its own office. The ring did what rings do. It made a man's hand larger than it is. He nodded to me. Custodianship is a kind of invisibility that sometimes earns a nod and stepped to the lectern. The ledger waited there, as if this were an ordinary night. Its chain lay coiled with that sly impersonation of sleep metal practices when it wants to appear less interested than it is. The page was blank for today's date, a clean snow waiting for tracks. The rightmost column, where verdicts go to become habits, waited with its usual composure. I felt in my sleeve the tiny weight of the broken seal press my wrist. A relic that believed it was a sin, or the other way around. He began in Latin, not with thunder but with administration. The rite as the ledger had taught him to speak it. Nouns first, then verbs, then the small, clean adverbs that tidy up the fear. The nuns answered in a tone the church teaches women who are asked to hold the world's grief in their laps without making a mess. The woman kept the child's name like a candle cupped in both hands so wind cannot steal it. I had heard that name before in a village far from here, over a font where the water remembered being part of a larger kindness. The prayer tightened around us like a belt. The exorcist's consonants clicked. The vowels kept their faces. Nothing in the room called itself extraordinary. That is how the extraordinary survives, by wearing a uniform. I moved toward the wall because men who keep keys learn to stand where they are useful and forgettable. The wall offered me its old cold, like a chair. If this were a simpler story, the demon would have obliged our superstition and manifested. But the target was not a tenant in the woman's body. The target, I understood with the unpleasant clarity of a mirror moved closer than courtesy demands, was an event, not a possession, a rescue. The ledger had pages for this. It called such things interventions on narratives. The priest's voice steadied at the edge where ritual meets policy. I watched his eyes flick. Not to the woman, but to the rightmost column of the ledger where the word oblatus would eventually settle like a bureaucrat's stamp. Forgotten. There would be witness names written in tidy lines. There would be a date, an hour, an imprimatur. There would be a receipt for a story that no longer embarrassed the hierarchy. The woman's name for her child went on. It did not plead. It identified. I have learned to fear identification more than pleading. Pleading can be negotiated. Identification names an address and insists the letter be delivered. A shiver in the room, nothing dramatic, merely the kind of draft that happens when a building decides to breathe. With one lung, instead of two, lifted the thin hairs on the back of my hand. I touched my sleeve. The red crescent of wax felt warmer than it had the right to feel. The Exorcist dipped his pen. The nib hovered over the blank column as if waiting for a train that everyone knows is late but no one dares mention. Oblitus was the train's name. The woman's voice did not rise or fall. It continued like water negotiating stones. The nun's hands, folded, unclasped, folded again. The ledger opened its absence to receive the official forgetting. I felt something animal in me lower its head. Habit. That is what I mean by animal. The part of a man that obeys because obedience has produced fewer bruises than rebellion. I did not intend to move. I have told you I am not brave, but my body's grammar is older than my decisions. And the keys in my hand, those patient teachers, shifted in their ring like a small bell choir finding the right pitch. My sleeve snagged on the lectern's corner, and the wax fragment leapt into my palm like a fish deciding its own net. A sliver of my skin opened a clean, foolish cut, and the blood, warm as a confession, met the red wax and made a color the ledger could not print. I set the crescent on the ledger's corner, where the original seal's scar still watched the room with its one blind eye. For a heartbeat, everything became measurement. The quill paused. The candle flame lengthened. The two nuns' breathing fell into the same count. The woman's syllables struck the same note twice in a row. The ring on the exorcist's hand hesitated above the pool of wax, as if recognizing itself in a photograph it did not remember posing for. Recognition is dangerous in rooms like this. It implies the existence of a memory we were about to pay to erase. "Tell me the child's name," I whispered. Not to the woman, her ownership of the name was secure. Not to the priest, his authority did not need it. I said it to myself, because I had learned that in these rooms the most honest witness is the one you keep from perjury at the cost of your own convenience. I said the name. The room did not approve or protest. It simply organized itself around the syllables. The exorcist lowered his hand. The ring kissed the mended wax. The ledger received the impression with a sigh so small only a man who has fallen in love with lead could have heard it. The pen descended. I saw the obedient hand begin the familiar curve toward an O, and then I saw the tremor. Not a failure of nerve, a correction of appetite. The curve swerved and came to rest on an S. He wrote, very clearly, very slowly, with the steadiness of a man who intends to be accused of neatness, if he must be accused at all. Solutus. Released. The word made no sound leaving the nib. The room made the sound for it. It exhaled. The nun's hands, without permission, unclasped fully and rested on the woman's wrists, not as restraint, not as comfort, as witness. The woman stopped saying the name not because she had been instructed, but because names, once returned, do not need to be shouted to stay in a room. The ring's face, pressed into the new wax, accepted its own missing crescent with the dignity of an old tool, allowed to pretend it had never been broken. I expected punishment, thunder, a supervisor's shoe in the corridor, the ledger snapping shut like a jaw. Nothing happened. The ledger did what it always does. It recorded. The priest's hand, having written solutus, added the time, the place, 2 initials, and a witness. Custodian present. No name. A function. Again. History is clever about that. The rite continued. Not as an eviction, but as a welcome. The cadence changed. Latin softened into something older than its own verbs. The prayer became a domestic instruction. Let the house admit its child. Let the mother sleep without having to swear she will never again pronounce what saved her. Let the story leave with its dignity intact. The woman opened her eyes as if waking from the kind of sleep that pays back a debt. Tears are a clumsy metaphor for such moments. Hers were not tears. They were a slowing of breath. The body has only a handful of ways to show relief, and the truest of them look like nothing at all. After, the nuns led her away along a corridor that prefers to be used by people who do not make demands. The exorcist remained. He wiped the nib against a felt that had learned to forgive ink. He closed the ledger with a care that was neither piety nor fear. Then he went very still, as if listening to a building give itself advice. "You should not have done that," he said finally, without looking up. He meant the wax. He meant the word. He meant, perhaps, the trespass of standing inside a ritual without a letter that said I could. "I know," I said. "Honesty is cheaper than rhetoric." "You used blood," he said. "You fixed a seal with what the seal was invented to outlive." I said nothing. He turned the ring in the light until the lion's padlock heart shrugged off the candle's drama. "That word has not been written in that column in—" He stopped, because measuring the interval would be a kind of admission. He put the ring in his pocket. He did not put it back on. "There is a price," he said finally, the way a man says rain when it has already soaked through the roof. "What is it?" I asked. He smiled the way men smile when they want to look as if they have not rehearsed the answer. "Administrative," he said. "The kind that leaves no mark unless you know where the marks are kept." He closed the ledger's clasp and set the key down gently, as if it were a small animal that had obeyed a difficult instruction. "Go home," he added, not unkindly. "Sleep the sleep that follows the correct word. Tomorrow it will be harder to find. That is how the world protects itself." He left without taking the book. He left without taking me. The candle snapped a little, as if pleased to be the only witness left who could be blamed. I picked up the ledger. It was heavier, not in pounds, but in a way an argument is heavier after someone has stopped trying to win it. I opened it to the entry we had made, because even victories do not feel real until they are checked twice. Solutus. The S lay on the page like a door opening toward the unthinkable. I closed the book, set the chain, and counted the floor tiles because counting is what a man does when blessings insist they are receipts. Outside, the night had not changed. The dome held the sky in its strong, shy way. The air invented a chill only as necessary. I carried the candle cupped and the seal fragment, now fused to its old scar, cooled into obedience. In my sleeve, The place where blood had met wax throbbed with that small, ridiculous pride that follows a correctness too modest to advertise. I walked home by the route the oldest ink recommended, past the bakery that remembers pilgrims by their ankles, past the fountain that tastes of old coins and advice. At my door, an envelope waited, with a particular blankness only an office can achieve. It did not say my name. It did not have to. Inside, a reassignment, duties in an archive that does not officially exist, the kind of room you ask for if you mean to continue in a straight line while the world bends, or the kind of room given to men who have confused verbs on a page. There was no threat, no condemnation, no signature. The price. Administrative. Clean. I sat with the envelope in my lap and tried to be grateful that punishment prefers silence when a city already has enough noise. Sleep came like a bribe. I woke before it had fully cashed, listless and clean and embarrassed to be both. I made coffee. I did not burn my tongue. I looked at the red crescent of wax on the sill and wondered whether objects forgive. The ring would sleep in a drawer tonight, I thought. The lion would practice being merely emblematic. Somewhere, a woman would say a child's name and not be asked to trade it for any theology. I put my hand flat on the sill and let the morning say it would do what mornings have always done: organize unpaid debts into hope. I returned to work. No one told me not to. The third stair greeted me with its usual ceremony, the lock performing its sequence of reluctances and consents like a doorkeeper whose primary devotion is to pace. I opened the room. The ledger sat correctly. The chain lay obediently. The page we had written did not correct itself in the night. There are legends of books doing that. This is not such a legend. Machines honor their most recent operator. Lorenzo found me wiping the brass with a care that could have passed for devotion. He looked at my sleeve where a brown stain had made a geography of guilt. "Paper cut," he said, which is how men say, "I see you," in buildings that prefer their kindness folded small. "Something like that," I said. He set a packet down cloth, sand, a new wick, without asking what the ledger had learned about me. "Sister M asked me to tell you," he added, dismantling a rumor into useful parts, "that the choir will sing in the courtyard at Vespers. They have borrowed an extra coat rack for the star." He held my gaze long enough to make speaking unnecessary. We both nodded. That masculine choreography that passes for absolution, Sister M, appeared as if summoned by her own reputation. She carried a basin that had seen every kind of water. "The woman?" I asked. "Because sometimes a single noun is an entire moral universe." "Home," she said. "Hungry." She ate. She slept. The kind of victory that never makes a calendar. She looked at the ledger, but did not approach. "There will be a receipt," she said sadly. "There always is." "There is," I said. "It says solutus." She closed her eyes for a moment, the way someone closes their eyes when the soup is better than they feared. "Be careful," she said, not because danger had increased, but because appetite had. Later, when the building expected me to settle into the new assignment, a room that had learned how to pretend it had never contained anything, I returned alone to the chapel. The brick remembered our breath. The tile stored our careful disrespect. I knelt, awkward as always, and ran my fingers over the lectern's edge where my sleeve had snagged. The splinter was still there, shy and proud. It was not heroism, I told the wood. It was grammar. The wood, fluent in older languages, made no effort to disagree. On my way out, I stopped at the drawers whose numbers had started to feel like cousins. 37. Ribbons, not for triumph, but for bookmarks in books that prefer to be left alone. 19. The sermon that mentioned a blessing that charges no debt, still only a sliver, still everything. 61. The cracked ring, sleeping like a veteran's medal. 52. The hair under glass, pale and stubborn, the saint who makes kitchens holier than sanctuaries, because kitchens are where hunger can see. Who pays? The ledger had learned to ask in margins, where the obedient hand could not erase the question. Who pays when a blessing is restored to its original mercy? Tonight, not the woman. Tonight, not the child. Tonight, an envelope and a room, and the precision of being overlooked. It is a good price. It is the only price I can afford. People will ask if anyone ever hears this and believes it, whether the church approved of what occurred. The church is a city. Cities have neighborhoods. Neighborhoods have their own weather. Approval is not the most interesting meteorology. What mattered was that a word appeared in a column where it had learned to be unwelcome. What mattered was that the ledger, that perfect machine, carried the S and did not grind it back into an O under cover of night. What mattered was that, for once, the blessing attended its proper work. It did not send an invoice. There is one more thing. The boy with the broom returned, knees and questions first, and leaned in the doorway with the arrogance only innocence can justify. "Brother says the bells were right last night," he announced. "Even if they weren't." I laughed because he had earned it. "How do you know?" He pointed to his chest with a small, unequivocal thumb. "Names," he said. He looked at the ledger in its chain and added confidingly, "Sometimes the book forgets how to say them out loud." Then he ran again, the broom clattering down for the second time, the building's music transposed briefly into the key of mischief. I lifted the broom and set it back where it belonged. The candle, watching me like a friend who refuses to manage my choices, understood. I breathed the small prayer the older keepers passed along when they trusted you with their real religion. Do not put a price on what was given free. Then I locked the door. The lock said its little consent. The corridor gave me my shadow, and, for the first time since I learned the grammar of keys, it weighed less. That night, I slept the sleep the exorcist had predicted, the sleep that follows the correct word. It is not heroic. It is not cinematic. It is the kind of sleep mothers have when a fever breaks and the window stays closed and the street has the decency not to honk. I woke before dawn and stood at the sill, where the wax crescent looked exactly like the moon lying to itself. The city organized its noises into a promise. I answered the only way I know how. I dressed. I lifted the ring of 12 keys, and I went to pay the next small bill the day would present, mindful that some debts write themselves in columns, and some are settled by a hand on a brow, and a word that refuses to charge. Mourning is not an absolution. It is a negotiation. The city asked for my attention in coins and footsteps and the polite tyranny of schedules, and I paid until my pocket was honest. Then I went where envelopes send the overlooked, the archive that does not officially exist. Official archives are proud of their air. This one borrowed air from rooms that the building would prefer you misremember. The door unpompous, tired paint, handle that sweats the palms of men who worry took my key as if it had never seen it before and then admitted we knew each other. Inside, the shelves had learned to stand like soldiers at ease, disciplined but willing to listen. The windows practiced a modesty almost comic for Rome, A city famous for light had given this room the kind that tastes like wool. It was a place for paper that needed to be left in peace until someone brave or foolish or both decided to disturb it. My assignment said inventory. It meant purgatory. I have learned to love punishments that ask for patience rather than confession. The ledger did not live here, but the ledger had cousins, binders without chains, folders whose brads had curled into arthritic hooks, envelopes with mouths gummed shut by 3 administrations' worth of policy. I began the ritual of the overlooked. Label, dust, list. Listen for the cough that means a page has decided to survive. On the second shelf, under a row of folios about rain that had never seen a storm, I found a thin box marked Calendaria Provisional. Provisional is a word institutions use when they mean permanent, but have not yet been given permission by their conscience. Inside lay a series of narrow books, spines the width of 2 fingers, each labeled with a year and a modest warning. Notes, not for liturgical use. The handwriting inside belonged to no one I knew. It wrote the way a careful man drives a borrowed car, attentive, respectful of the edges, aware that he will have to explain any new dents. The notes were the minutes of a conversation between Days and their handlers. Feast moved 1 day forward to avoid collision with morning of bridge collapse. Read 1. Rumor of starry portent pacified by declaring a fast for reasons of temperance. Read another. The rightmost columns there are always rightmost columns, had been left blank, as if whoever compiled the book wanted the world to decide later whether these were repairs or injuries. On the last page of one, a single word had been penciled, softer and fainter than accounting should allow. Debitum debt. The pencil's lead had smeared into the paper's grain like the last charcoal smudge of a child's drawing on a kitchen wall. I replaced the booklet and wrote, in my small notebook, 4 numbers and the words, "Keep the lamp." It was not courage, it was consent. Then I went to work the way a man works when he has discovered that dust is both blanket and witness. I counted, I sorted, I let the room correct my posture. I tried to behave as if my presence did not increase the building's appetite for secrets. We tell ourselves these lies to stay employed. Toward noon, when the basilica's hum shifts into the key of commerce and ruins become photographs, and the ruins of photographs become advertisements, I heard a sound you cannot inventory, a breath at the threshold of a decision. The door did not open. The breath withdrew. I walked to the landing and found nothing but a chalk mark at ankle height, hastily drawn, shaped like a compass rose and labeled bread, water, fire, names, doors. A child's hand had added a 6th point. Badly, bravely, questions. I knelt and ran a finger over the chalk. The powder bowed to my skin with the obedience of simple tools. Back at the desk, I took my time unlocking the drawer marked Inscriptions Reconsidered. The iron protested, then apologized. Inside, alongside rubbings and photographs, lay a stack of slips cut from the margins of other men's sincerity. On each, in a dozen inks and twice as many tempers, a similar sentence: do not announce, delay notice, let it pass without public naming. The caution that kept a widow from reading doom into an eclipse also kept a neighborhood from reading hope into the wrong door. Names are not decorations, they are engines. I sorted those slips into piles that looked like a nervous man's prayer. On the bottom of the stack, old and brittle and somehow fresh, I found a hand I recognized, the left-leaning sailor, without the ledger's obedient counterpart to soften him. In a tight, stubborn script, the note said, "When you remove a name in public, restore 3 in private." Underlined. 3. The paper had been folded and unfolded until its fibers obeyed the crease like a vow. I tucked the slip into my notebook and told myself I would earn its instruction the way one earns the right to open a hatch in the floor, by listening longer than my impatience prefers. Afternoon taught me the archive's temperament. It liked hands that weighed their intentions as if they were coins. It disliked pens that arrived with sermons. It tolerated candles if they behaved. It despised whispers that treated it as accomplice rather than witness. I have known men. This room knew men better. I met Sister M near the hour when courtyards turn into chapels. She stood with a wooden crate in her arms, the kind of crate that promises nothing and delivers more than promises ever could. "For you," she said, as if a gift could pass between 2 rooms without telling the building. Inside lay index cards written with the self-respect of old women's handwriting letters, formed by habits learned at kitchen tables where flour and grammar competed for elbow space. Each card carried a name and a gloss, a story reduced to its honest summary. "We keep what they will not keep," she said. "Not canonization, not defiance, just memory." She set the crate on the desk, studied my face for the lies men tell under the banner of sincerity, found something she could forgive, and left. I spread the cards like a deck of saints and sinners who refused those labels. Benedetta, midwife. Giorgio, stonemason who repaired the fountain without being paid. Marina, sold her wedding ring to feed 5 families during the strike. No feast days. No official miracles. The left-leaning hand had written a blessing on the top card, as if embarrassed to be caught in piety. A city lives by the names it says at supper. I felt the odd, surging gratitude one feels when a stranger teaches you the word you have needed to think with for years. A word like memoratus, remembered. Evening brought the choir into the courtyard, their star mounted on a coat rack, ridiculous and perfect. The window admitted the music in ribbons thin enough to thread a needle. The boys sang the way children do, when they have been told not to understand too much, clean, loud, tethered to the pitch by duty and delight. I let the sound mend a corner of the room I had scuffed with my indignation. Then I blew the candle down to a hum and walked to the chapel, because some debts cannot be paid with paperwork. The lectern remembered my sleeve. The splinter, shy and proud, had not been sanded away. I laid my palm on the wood and repeated what I had learned to call the smaller blessing, the one no ledger could invoice. "Stay awake." The room agreed in brick. I opened the ledger because machines, like children, deserve to be told aloud when they have done something right. The page with solutus had not been corrected. I admit I was surprised. I had half expected the neat O to have returned in the night, obedient as a forgiven sin. It had not. The S smiled like a scar that refuses the surgeon's tidy revision. A boy's footsteps appeared at the door, and the broom performed its old melodrama. He leaned in. "Hair at angles rebellion would envy. Brother says, if the bells are wrong again, we can sing the names instead," he confided. "Just in the courtyard so it doesn't wake the saints." I nodded, because a nod is the simplest way to agree to a liturgy. "What names?" I asked. He seemed genuinely insulted by the question. "Everybody's," he said. Then he ran, and the corridor, seasoned by centuries of solemnity, suffered hope like a ticklish child. I shut the ledger and turned to go, and that is when the building, patient beyond my patience, opened the door it had been teaching me to deserve. Not literally. Locks do not unlock themselves for men who need their hands to stay blameless. But the 13th step the hatch under the mosaic of Orion kneeling made itself available in the oldest human way. It allowed my feet to remember. I walked the route the leftmost ink had instructed. I counted the tiles with my breath. I found the seam by absence, the absence of echo, the absence of dust, the absence of the building's usual small sarcasm. I laid the candle on its side, I slid my fingers under the lip, and I lifted. Warmth first. Not the warmth of fire, the warmth of paper that has been read recently. The warmth of breath. The light went down and came back thinner. I lowered myself like a man descending into a confession he cannot delegate. The space was not dramatic, shelves only, shallow. A bench for a patient back. A box no larger than a child's coffin, and less solemn. On the lid of the box, impressed into leather with a dye that had not been used in a century, a word, memoranda. Inside lay what the building had been hoarding the way some men hoard second chances. Pages of additions, corrections to the corrections, names restored in pencil where ink had removed them, dates penciled into margins where time had been shaved for pastoral or political reasons. The left-leaning hand lived here like a resident, but other hands had joined him. They had written the words the ledger never allowed itself to write at the ends of official lines. But she was there. He did it, not the bishop. The eclipse frightened us, but it passed, and we laughed, and we ate, and we slept. The rumor fed the hungry before the notice could arrive. The child's fever left on a Tuesday. We kept the Tuesday holy without asking permission. I sat, because men with knees must. I read, because books are the only rooms that make time behave when it wants to swagger. I found, near the bottom, a sheet that belonged to my week to our page. A hand I had not seen before, spidery and precise, had added beneath the date and the time and the neat new word. Witness, added by breath, not by ink. 2 nuns, 1 custodian, 1 ring that consented. On the back, in faint graphite, the kind of faith that refuses capitals. No invoice. It is an odd thing to feel forgiven by a room you have been taught to distrust. The heat in my chest did not claim to be virtue. It claimed to be recognition. I put the sheets back with a tenderness I have given only to infants a handful of times, and to the dying more often than anyone should have to. I closed the box. I closed the hatch. The mosaic resumed its indifference. Orion kept his posture, kneeling so that small hands could reach the stars. Upstairs, the choir finished, and the courtyard applauded with the manners. Children teach their elders on nights it is safe to be easily pleased. I went back to the archive that does not exist, and did the least dramatic thing a man can do after a secret admits him. I wrote a list, not of revelations, of tasks. Replace wick in cup 6. 3 cards to be refiled with names first. Copy left-leaning slip. Restore 3 names in private. Move lamp for funeral route. 3 days. Count the children after storms, I wrote. Buy bread, and underlined it with the stubbornness of a believer. Near midnight, the exorcist appeared at the door. He carried himself the way a man does when his ring sleeps in a drawer, lighter, lonelier. He looked at my hands, at the boxes, at the little crate of kitchen saints. "It is not my room," he said, a statement that protected us both. "Nor mine," I answered, and we exchanged the secular sacrament of shrugging in unison. "There will be inquiries about the ledger," he added. "Questions that do not expect answers." "I know that rhythm," I said. He nodded toward the crate. "Keep those dry," he said. "Water takes sides." Then he left, because an honest exchange cannot survive a second sentence in such rooms. When the hour grew thin, the time old men call the between, I returned to the chapel once more and placed my hand flat on the ledger's cover. I did the older keeper's small prayer. Enough for now. Then I improvisationally risked a second line, the sort of liberty that costs more the next day. Teach me where to carry what cannot be filed. The building, devout in its way, consented by not contradicting me. You asked for a documentary. All I can give you is an affidavit signed by small objects, the key ring that taught my hands grammar, the lamp that corrected distances, the wax crescent that learned to behave like a relic, not because it was holy, but because it was stubborn, the chain that pretended to be sleep, the ledger that preferred nouns to people until a man wrote solutus and a machine obeyed him, the hatch that was a step until it was a door, the box labeled memoranda in a room that refuses to be real, the crate of names that make a city worth the noise it makes. I could end here with the tasteful restraint this building loves and allow the rest to remain implied. But restraint is one of the tools the ledger used to train us. I prefer what kitchens prefer, plain speech. Do not stop asking questions. This is not a rallying cry. It is an instruction manual for the maintenance of human rooms. Ask them in the tone you use when you wake a sleeping child, patient, low, ready to listen to nonsense until the sense arrives. Ask them at supper. Ask them in courtyards, while stars rehearse their better stories on coat racks. Ask them when the bells are wrong and also when the bells are right, because the rightness was negotiated against someone else's grief. Ask them about calendars that pretend to be neutral, and about maps that move hunger to better neighborhoods, and about ledgers that tidy the miracles into footnotes until nothing sticks to memory but dust. Ask them about debt and who pays. Ask them about names and who guards their storage. Write things down in pencil where ink has been forbidden. Restore 3 names in private for every one you are asked to remove in public. If a feast is moved, feed someone. If a rumor is pacified, find out what it had tried to do for the poor and do it without a notice. If a saint is reassigned to anonymous mercy, light a candle in a kitchen and call that mercy by the name you inherited from someone who washed your face when you were too frightened to sleep. Teach children to count the names when the bells are wrong. Count bread, count water, count fire, only to learn how not to worship it. Count doors. Mark the ones that open when they should not, and the ones that pretend not to exist. Teach them that maps can lie with tenderness, and that tenderness without honesty becomes a muzzle. Teach them that memory is not a museum, it is a pantry. When you meet a ledger, a machine that has been taught to prefer closure to truth, do not shout at it. Machines enjoy being shouted at. It helps them label you correctly. Write in the margins instead. Use the left-leaning hand if it helps you remember that bodies tilt in weather. Where the rightmost column insists on oblitus, be ready to write the word that begins with S when the room is honest enough to hear it. And where both fail, where forgetting is the only column, where rectification arrives like a polite injury ad, in a pencil that smudges, The word that sent me to this small pulpit tonight. Memoratus, remembered. I cannot give you access to the rooms that taught me these nouns. I can give you, at the door of your own house, the smallest blessing I now trust, one that charges no debt, one that does not turn charity into a receipt, one that does not add your grief to an account you are never allowed to read. Hold on to your names. Speak them. Teach them to your children the way you teach them the way home. Keep small lists in your pockets, dates that tried to escape, corners where kindness happened without permission, streets that tell the truth only at 3 a.m. Keep candles for rooms that prefer gentle light. Move lamps when funerals pass under them. When an eclipse arrives, and men in collars or coats tell you not to look, decide for yourself whether fear deserves your eyes. If you choose not to, live with that choice kindly. If you choose to, teach someone afterward what you saw without pretending you are the only one who can see. The most dangerous thing to them, and you know who them is without my saying, is memory returning, not the weaponized memory that marches into the square looking for enemies. The humble kind that comes home at dawn and makes coffee and writes a name on a card and puts the card in a box labeled with a word any bureaucracy would laugh at. Memoranda. The kind that turns rumors into breadlines and feasts into redistributions of heat and calendars into quilts hand-stitched by women who refuse to let winter have the last word. If you dream tonight, let the dream return with you in the morning. Write what you can. Whisper what you must. Hide nothing from the person you hand a cup of water to. Correct no one's hope unless you are prepared to feed them. And when you pass a locked door, any locked door, offer it the small courtesy we offer to elders whose rules we do not fully trust. Touch the frame, breathe politely, and say under your breath, "Enough for now." Then ask your question anyway. Good night. Stay curious. Keep the lamps where they are needed. Carry in your sleeve a tiny, stubborn crescent of something that refuses to be filed. That is how the world gets its memory back.